Chapter 337. Brando fell into a daze the moment he stepped out of the carriage. This was out of everyone's expectations, but he quickly shook his head to get rid of this temporary worry. Compared to the troubles he had to deal with now, this matter could barely be placed at the back of his mind. He suddenly felt that his journey was full of twists and turns, and there were too many difficulties. This was the reason why he rushed back to AB's castle. Yesterday, the Shire had sent him a telepathic message. Scarlett's condition had worsened and she might not make it past today. Brando's mood, which had just improved recently, immediately turned gloomy. Other than the Shire, he was probably the only one who knew Scarlett's condition the best. But in order to deal with Schaflund as soon as possible, he could only force himself not to think of the worst. However, some things did not change based on subjective wishes. Even though Brando had made the most thorough preparations, Scarlett still made it to this day. In fact, on the second day after he took control of Schaflund Mine, he had ordered a group of mercenaries in Medisha to send Scarlett back to his territory so that the Shire could control the spread of the blood of God in her body. Although this squire of his didn't seem like a reliable person, he was still a gold-ranked wizard. He was much stronger than a gold-ranked swordsman and a half-baked elementalist when it came to these mystical fields. Unfortunately, Brando also understood that no matter how strong the Shire was, he could not reverse what had already happened. Scarlett's body had already died once. It was the blood of God's powerful energy that reversed life and death and pulled her soul back from the underworld. However, this was not without a price. The blood of God was neither a savior nor a red cross. This ownerless divine power would not be so kind as to help an ordinary person for no reason. The blood of God's goal was to preserve Scarlett's soul so that it could better integrate with the body and not cause any rejection. Once this goal was achieved, Scarlett's soul would become its enemy. The blood of God had no consciousness, and all of its actions were based on its instincts. Therefore, Scarlett would be defeated shortly after the blood of God regained control of her body. The Shire had tried their best to delay the process, but no external force could change the imbalance in Scarlett's body. Sooner or later this day would come. Brando couldn't relax when he thought about this, and he lost most of his interest in chatting with Odom in the carriage. However, he knew that he had to finish his words. He was not only the lord that the red-haired girl had chosen to follow, but he was also the master of all the people on this land. At least for now. He could feel this responsibility at any time, so he turned around and looked at the tired old dwarf in the carriage. Odom was not used to carriages. He was allergic to silk curtains and could not stand the bumpy ride. There would probably be Brando's words in the army trying to show off the old dwarf probably wouldn't have been able to hold on. Brando was well aware of this history. From now on, and naturally knew this was the greatest trouble the territory dragon had encountered. Brando said there is no need for resistance. Just Brando shook his head. If it wasn't defeated or supporting him and also the young Dark Lord, she should be accompanied enemies on to be anything in this war. She had a good relationship with the young man immediately was wild had a good relationship with everyone. If he could ask for Roman, he would be willing to wait until the entire 3 days ago to ask unfortunately the enemy would not give him this opportunity. Brando looked at the Brando asked the Shire about the people who were sent to investigate Merwin's southern leadership. But Lord unfortunately the answer he received was I don't have the manpower. The Shire had told me that the men he had sent out had been disappearing without a trace. They knew that Cornelius and Grandmaster Bosley handed over the related Brando's plan as long as they can ask them if you have any questions, would be able to gain the recognition of the royal faction. The old dwarf and as long as they gained the recognition of the royal faction about construction. The people in the territory would be able to state in his innate talent. Otherwise, no matter how hard they tried, they would be like there should be some books on construction. In this ancient kingdom, or even in this era of his lord status, the mercenaries that were sent to the Parejo Mountains either never returned to might well experience information or any the mercenaries that were sent to the old Brando knew that he had just woken up. However, Brando knew that the mercenaries that were sent out only then did he remember that the young man was only 2,000 human soldiers and Yuta all had their own plans. He had known that the mercenaries just wanted to get the entire tribe in his hands. Some of the mercenaries that were sent out immediately ran away. As for the affairs, Brando was a lot of case, but he did not intend their forces to stay. He could just pack up those who were willing to stay with Golden Dwarfs. Brando thought trustworthy. He was a dwarf. Of course, Brando was not going to sit around and was going to invest in quelling the shadows of the war in Titan's kingdom. But it wasn't strange for its fate to not arrange for his trust. Even though one or two moreover would not be chased away by Erwin's ruler, it might not be regarded as a zero in the eyes of his proceeding in an orderly manner. Ever since the Second Holy War, the construction of the city walls was already exhausted at the end of the month of frost. But now Brando's construction period was a week later than back to reality. And the resource he realized that even though he was the chief architect, he only didn't have any manpower. Brando did not want to repair the walls. He didn't seem to have any ability. In fact, the construction would not go as he had time to do something that would cost him for a long time. And in the end, he still felt with Martha's help he might not external prestige was still intact. He thought the young man asked him if he had confidence in the castle that would go down in history. The originally agreed policy of appeasement was met seemed to have left almost immediately. Can build a castle that would go down in history. I suspect that there had been no nobles ran or the fields of revenge that would fall. Brando shook his head. Amandina quickly realized that he could imagine that the young man in front of him was surrounded death if so as the commoners were not. Count Randor had an agreement broke out, there would definitely use it to get them to work. After understanding his side, she finally understood her mistake. Thanking him. Brando had no choice but to use force to make up for this mistake. The old dwarf was just in order to ensure the completion of the construction period. He was also very tired. She even had rushed back in the middle of the night and chatted with Odom. She personally led her men to the outskirts of the city and chased the commoners out of their huts for more than 4 hours. She ordered them to gather in the square and as a lord there was always an endless amount of work to do. Then she ordered the mercenaries to supervise their work. He would never have thought that he would be so hardworking as an otaku one day. But that was the truth and it was still unavoidable. This made Odom smile bitterly. Quickly felt spread among the commoners. To the starting point. That day passed in the midst of the workers coping in his previous world to the supervisors. He might have been able to achieve great things. But this change in attitude came after there weren't so many ifs in this world. Out of everyone's expectations, the worry when he thought about Scarlet prepared a sumptuous dinner mixed with exhaustion. Not only was there a rare white bread for dinner, there was even a frown when she saw him like this. Of course, the stew did not live up to its name for a moment. It was so clear that there was only water and no meat. Who was holding onto the door of the carriage and was still discussing business with him. There was no lack of trust in that one could see the bottom, and no matter how thick-skinned he was, he could not help but feel his ears turn red. But it was not because the mercenaries were harsh. Not daring to face the young man's gaze from the forest. He hesitated whether he should reveal the truth. Even though there was a lot of meat, but in the end he decided not to. He was afraid that originally worried that the workers would vomit blood and but the development of the situation was completely out of her expectations. Of course, he was more afraid that the young man's these refugees who had been living in the slums all year round, no matter how brave when they smelled the rich aroma of the broth, they could be killed with a single stab. Brighter than the hungriest wolf in the forest. There was no need for a second stab. In their eyes, he thought for a moment and decided to just muddle through, and they could only get a little during festivals or on important construction. As for me, could only at the end vaguely to Brando's words. It depended on whether the young man recalled his experience in the game with some leftovers. He finally grasped the crux of the matter when he talked about the drainage system and the disposal of garbage. When she saw the way the workers wolfed down the food, the golden dwarves realized that she had made another building underground mines. She remembered the time when she was in They were the best miners and she could only eat a little black bread. And although they did not produce much sewage when they lived in the tunnels, Amandina knew that the golden dwarves had calmed the hearts of dealing with household waste. She said that as long as they did not bathe in their entire lives, everyone would be able to eat such food every day. In fact, a city with more than 100,000 people would produce a large amount of garbage and sewage every day. Most of them were willing to stay and see the situation in time, not to mention that even if they did not want to stay, this was one of the reasons why there weren't any large cities in areas where civilization couldn't reach. The Mist Devil had indeed fulfilled her promise and allowed them drainage and disposal of garbage were similar to stewed meat soup every night. And he felt that he could use the golden result of this was that the amount of meat in the warehouse quickly decreased because there was not much to begin with. And of course the meat in the warehouse came from the domesticated livestock in the territory. The old dwarf realized that some things didn't seem so complicated when he focused on squeezing out his potential. In the past, the meat was provided through Groddon and his men, to the young but now lord. It was used to feed hundreds finally of people. Relaxed when he saw naturally the supply could not meet the demand. He turned around to look at Cornelius and Amandina were not far away from him, saying that if she continued to consume like this, any expression their lord on their would faces. Not be able to eat a single meal. Young Brando wasn't in a good mood. Amandina was moved by her words. Brando on one side was the young lord whom she respected the most. All right, bring me there. And on the other side were the workers who came from the refugee camp. The wild elf's tone did not have to think about it to choose the former. But her words betrayed her thoughts. But after thinking about it again and again, she insisted on her own way. Brando took a deep breath. She asked the mercenaries to hunt in the forest but he knew that Scarlet's life could be in danger at any daily training just to replenish their meat consumption. Otherwise, he wouldn't have left everything behind and rushed back in the middle of the unexpected benefits. After all, he had promised the red-haired girl in Shaflan gradually found out that the demon lady that was arranged for them to come back and fulfill outside the city in order to ensure that they would have enough for dinner. The fate of this ancient kingdom. She even arranged for them to hunt in the old lord's he had to change the fate of everyone around him. This method moved everyone. Until I just secretly asked the mercenaries to tell her that she did not need to spend so much money. For a long time, it was already good enough to have white bread every day. I've let the workers began to worry that the young lord would punish the kind and benevolent noble lady because had left. But their actions strengthened Amandina's in a long time. Not and I even forgot she also told the workers that it was not her, but the Lord who arranged all of this, so they did not have to worry at all. Chapter
Amberlight
338.
used this small explanation to push all the credit to Brendel,
on the southwest side
coupled
of the
with
castle,
the fact that the young
where
lord
Seal
had reduced the
Scarlet.
taxes previously.
The room's main
He had
color
gained
scheme
a high
was light
reputation
green,
among the
and
lower
the branches
class
of
for
an
a short
ancient
period of
mangrove
time.
tree could be seen
Of course,
from the window.
Brando did not know
In the
about
distance,
this at that
there was a
time.
distant view
He
of
was dealing
Trentheim,
with the matters of
the
the
dark
mines and
forest
Shaftland
and the shadows
did
of the
not know what
mountains
was happening
happening
in
in
his
his territory.
territory on the horizon.
In fact,
When
Amberlight
led
did
Brando
not
to the
think that
room,
her actions
the
would
young
be
wizard had
successful
already
at first.
received news that
She
his
did not
master
have
had
any
returned and
experience
was
in
waiting
managing a
outside.
territory,
How
and
is
only
it?
had a few short
Brando asked
discussions
as
with
soon as he
Brando
saw
during
the
the
Shire.
journey.
But
Not
she
too
soon
good,
realized
the
that she
Shire
did not do
replied.
anything wrong.
Miss Roman,
Less than a
Amandina,
week
and
after the
Medisha are all
implementation of
inside.
the corresponding
Brando nodded
countermeasures,
and entered the
someone
room
asked
without
her
saying
through
a
the
word.
mercenaries if the Count
Scarlet's
needed
room
more
was not an
manpower.
intensive care
This
unit,
was obviously
and he
a
did not
signal
smell
that her
her strong
construction
smell of
site could
medicine
attract
as soon
more
as he
workers.
opened the door.
But that was
There
not
was
all.
even a sense of
This meant that
tranquility
the
in the
old
room.
noble's authority
When he
and
opened
the
the
new
door,
lord's
he
authority
saw
were
that the
beginning
curtains
to
in
waver.
front of him were
This
gently
was no
raised,
doubt a good sign.
revealing a corner
But
of
the only
Avi's
thing that
castle.
Amandina regretted
Brando's
was that the
entrance
good
brought a
sign
slight
did not
breeze
change
into
the
the
fact
room.
that the
A
construction
gentle
project
breeze
was delayed.
lifted the curtains of
On
the
one
princess
hand,
bed
too
in
much
the
time
middle
was
of the
wasted
room.
in the beginning,
The original
and on the
owner
other
of this
hand,
bed had
none
long
of them
been
were
unknown,
proficient in
but
construction
Scarlet
and
was
engineering.
currently lying on it.
Master Bosley's
Under the veil,
participation
the
might
girl's
have
face
more or
was
less
pale
made
and
up
her
for the
eyes
lack
were
of
gently
manpower,
closed.
but the
It was
kingdom's
the first time
blacksmith
Brando
wasn't a
saw
true
the girl with
professional.
her ponytail
He might have
untied.
his own unique
Her soft
insights
red
on how
hair
to craft
covered
a
part of
magical
her
armor,
face,
making
but that
her
didn't
look
mean that he
extremely
wasn't a true
delicate.
professional.
She was very
But it was
quiet.
definitely not
It was not
repairing
the
a section
usual
of the wall.
stubbornness of silence,
This dilemma
but a
was
true
finally
silence.
resolved when Odom,
She did not
the
make a
old
sound
dwarf,
as if she was
Shaftland
immersed in
mines,
her own
joined in.
dreams. No matter how
Unfortunately,
unreliable
Brando
the
knew
old
that it
dwarf
was a
was,
nightmare.
he had at least learned a
Otherwise,
few
the girl
things
would
from his
not have
fellow
frowned
mountain
slightly
dwarves.
with a pained
After
expression.
correcting a few
When
of the
Medisha
original
and Amandina
misconceptions,
saw Brando
the
enter,
construction
they
process
both stood
quickly
up at the same
accelerated,
time.
and by the
The
end of
elven
the month,
princess
it
nodded
was
slightly,
finally completed.
while Amandina
On the
looked
morning
at the
of
young
the
man
completion
without
of the
moving,
project,
a trace of
Amandina
worry in her
invited
eyes.
Brando, Medisha,
Although she
the
didn't know
Shire,
what
and
happened
all of the
under
young man's
Shaftland,
trusted
she knew that
subordinates. Scarlet's situation wasn't optimistic.
Amandina,
She had asked
Scarlet,
Seal
and
about
Roman
the situation
in the morning mist,
but the young wizard
quietly
only
looking
told
at
her
the
to
wall
wait for
that
the
was
Lord to
looming
come
in the
back
early
and deal
winter
with
mist.
it. This
Amandina
caused her heart
could
to
not
sink.
help but let out
She
a
was a
long
simple
sigh.
girl. But
She
she
had
had
always
always
been
been
calm in
calm
her
and
heart
turned
so
to
that
look
she
at
could be a
Brando, who was
competent
also looking
advisor.
in the same direction.
However, just like how
she
she
said
blamed herself for the
apologetically,
death
"I'm
of
sorry,
her
my
wild
lord,
elf
for wasting
sister
so
back
much
in the
time."
mountains of Chablis.
Brando looked at
She
his
didn't
aide
want
with
anyone
eyes
in the
full of
group to
praise.
meet with any mishap.
He remembered that when he was in
Amandina knew
brags,
that this
he felt
idea was
lucky that he
childish
was
and
able
even
to find a
ridiculous.
subordinate who could
Since
create a
ancient
mana
times,
channeling device.
there was no conflict
This was
between
undoubtedly
nobles
something
without
that made him
bloodshed,
happier
but
than
she was
picking up
unwilling
gold
to
by
give
the
up on
roadside.
this point.
But it was
Calm
only
but
today
not
that he
cold-blooded,
realized that he had
this
not
was
only
something
picked
that
up a
Brando had
treasure,
taught her,
but also a
my
priceless
lord.
treasure. The young lady
Amandina
asked
was
in
a
a low
quiet
voice,
girl,
but she had her own principles. But he immediately saw
Brando
a
could
small
see that
figure
she was
lying on the
determined
other
to
side of
uphold
the
her
bed,
ideals and
sleeping
beliefs.
soundly. He felt
The
that he
merchant
was
girl
worthy
did
of
not
having
seem to
such an
notice the changing
outstanding girl
girl
serve him
surroundings,
wholeheartedly,
to the point that a
after
string of
returning to his
sparkling drool
territory,
flowed out from
he
the corner
carefully
of her
understood
mouth
the
and
work
dripped
of
onto
this
the
noble
blanket.
girl.
Brando
He was
looked at the
originally
girl's
worried that
expression in her
Amandina,
dream,
who had no
her
experience
eyebrows
in
raised
governing a
non-stop,
territory, and he
would
knew
run
that she
into
was
a lot of
probably
trouble.
breaking through the
He even
obstacles in her
estimated
dream.
that the wall would
Of
take
course,
until next
that
month.
was only in her
It would only be
imagination,
completed in
and
the
it was
middle
of no
of the
help to
slumbering
the
month.
red-haired girl at
Even
this
though
moment.
it was not a big
But
problem,
the young man
it
knew
would
that
be
the
more or
Roman's
less
thoughts were
inconvenient
extremely
if it was
simple,
delayed until
and
the
there was
first
not a
snowfall.
trace of impurity
But
in their
Amandina
actions.
gave him a big surprise.
Of course, this was except
She
for
completed
business.
the task with
Thus,
her usual
he raised his
seriousness
eyebrows and did not have the heart to
exceeding
reprimand
his
her.
expectations.
Brando walked to Scarlett's
Not only that,
bedside and
Bosley
turned
and
around to
Odom's
ask,
performance was
"What is
also
she doing?"
satisfactory,
Telling
with the
Scarlett a
exception of the
story.
old dwarf who
Medisha
seemed to be a little
replied,
timid.
Telling a
He
story?
looked at Amandina
The Roman
and nodded
girl
with
said
a
that
faint
when she was
smile of
sick when she
approval.
was young,
To
her
be
aunt would
continued,
tell her
if
a
you want to
story.
know what will happen
After
next,
listening to the
please
story,
go to
her illness was
www.
cured. The silver elf girl
Calm down
added
more
in a small
chapters.
voice, "Support the
And then,
author, support
seeing
the
Medisha
original
and the
reading."
noble girl's smile,
Brando
knew that this guy was doing something useless again.
Chapter 345.
If the Roman's aunt was a witch,
what do you
then
think?
she should have used
Brando
a kind of
suddenly
magic.
asked.
Holy
The young
magic
man
was
asked
one of the
Rabban
witch's
and
many
Cornelius,
spells, who were also
but this was
standing in
something
the
that could
fog,
not be learned
rubbing
by
their
imitation,
hands and exhaling
but the
white
Roman
smoke.
obviously did not
After
realize
Janna's
this.
departure,
He did
these
not
two
wake the
commanders
merchant
who had
girl
known
up,
each other
but
for
his
a long
gaze
time
had
had gotten
gotten
closer.
closer.
It had only been a week,
Rabban
but
and
the red-haired
Cornelius
girl
met
had
this young
completely
lord.
changed.
They did not like
She
each
had
other.
lost her usual
Therefore,
vitality
the distance
and health,
between people
and
was
her
actually
face
a
was
very
pale
subtle
as
thing.
paper.
After
Her whole
hearing the
body
young
seemed
lord's
to have lost
question,
a lot of weight,
there was a moment
and her
of
skin
silence.
gradually became
But the first to
transparent,
speak was
and the
Romain.
blood vessels underneath
Romain
could
had
be
already
seen
changed
clearly.
into a thick
In
winter
sharp
coat
contrast
and a
to
pair
her
of deerskin
crystal-like
gloves.
skin,
Even
a layer
so,
of
her face was
eye-catching
still
black
red from
patterns
the
was
cold.
growing on her neck.
Even the tip of her
These
nose was
patterns spread
slightly
over
red.
her slender neck
Roman
and
thinks
extended
it's
to
good.
her face.
What do you think, Brando?
Seeing her like this, Brando's
She
heart
exhaled
sank.
a breath of white
The blood
steam
of
and
God
said
had
with
begun to spread,
intention of
and
scheming.
even though the Shire
She
tried
even
his
turned
best
to look at
suppress
Brando
it,
with her
this
eyes
tenacious
wide
thing
open,
could not
as
be
if she
stopped
wanted
from
to see
spreading
if he
to the
agreed
grain.
with her words.
If this
The
continued,
group of
there
small
would be no
mercenary group
red-haired
leaders
girl
immediately
called Scarlet
agreed.
in this world by
That's
tomorrow
right,
morning.
Cornelius
Medisha
added.
and
It's
Amandina saw that
unexpectedly
their
good.
omnipotent Lord
Even
did
though
not
it's a
say
little
a
late,
word,
forgive me
and
for
they
being
immediately
blunt.
understood
I've
Scarlet's
also
situation.
participated in the midterm
Even though
work,
the Silver
and to
Elf
be
girl
honest,
was
we're
not
not
good
too
at
familiar
expressing
with
her
it.
feelings,
Lady
she could not
Amandina
help
has
but
done very
softly
well.
ask, I
My
wouldn't
lord,
dare to say that it's
Brando
perfect,
only shook
but
his
it's at
head.
least surprising.
The patterns on Scarlett's
Everyone
body
loved
should
to
have
hear
originated
flattery,
from her
and
heart.
even Romaine could
That
not
was the
help
place
but
where
look
the
at this
blood of
handsome
God was
silver-haired
injected,
man,
which was also
even
the
though
heart.
she did not
In
seem
fact,
to agree
this
with
was
his
the most
flattery,
troublesome
she
way
could
to
not
inject
help
the
but
blood
agree
of
with
God.
him. She
The person
thought about
who
how
used
she
the
had been
blood
through
of
a lot
God
in the
must have
past
been very
month.
experienced.
Almost every
Faced
small
with this
decision
method
she
of
made could be
injecting the
met
blood
with
of
an
God,
accident that
the
she did
Shire
not
and
consider
Brando could only
beforehand.
be at their wits'
However,
end.
it was
If they
precisely
wanted to
because
save
of these
Scarlett, they had
unexpected
to kill the
situations
blood
that
of
she
God.
became more and more
But
proficient
the
in
blood of
handling
God
them.
was the only thing
Indeed,
keeping
it's
Scarlett
surprising.
alive.
Even
Rabin
if
did
they
not
had a
say
way to
much,
destroy
and his
the
words
blood
were
of God,
concise.
they would still
But
have to kill
Romaine
this
still
red-haired
secretly
girl.
looked at her lord.
Moreover, they did
In
not
her
have
heart,
a way to do
the
so.
young man's opinion
Another
was
method
enough
was
to
also
trump all
suitable for
opinions.
this kind of situation
This was
where
the
the
first
body was
time she felt her
occupied
heart beat
or was
so
in the
fast,
process of being
and she was
occupied,
afraid that she would
and that
see
was
the
to erase
slightest
the will that
dissatisfaction on
dominated
Brando's
the body.
face.
But
She
made
just
Brando
happened to see
helpless was that
Brando
the blood
looking
of
at her
God
with
did not have a
unconcealed
will,
admiration,
and was driven
and
by
she could not
instinct.
help but be
Thus
startled.
this method also
She did
sealed
not
his
know
path.
why, but she
He
suddenly
saw the
felt the
patterns
lump in
on
her
Scarlett's
throat.
neck slowly
It was as
growing
if all her
upwards,
hard
like
work over the
blood-sucking
past few
thorns
months
that
had
slowly
paid off in
sucked
this
away the
moment.
girl's life.
She
Or
sniffled and
perhaps
turned
it
her
was a
head away,
slow-acting
lest she
poison that would
cried in
take her
front of
life
so many
once the
people
time
and
was
make a
up.
fool of herself.
But Brando stood
At
by
least
the
she
bed,
still
and for a
remembered that
moment
she
there
was
was nothing
Brando's
he could
number
do.
one aide and
There
the
was a way
person
to
in
quench
charge
his
of the
thirst with
territory's
poison.
affairs.
He
She
frowned.
did not want to
But
embarrass
at this
Brando.
moment, a voice
When she
sounded
turned
in
her
his
head,
mind.
she saw
Little
Medisha
one.
pass a silk handkerchief over.
Brando tilted
The
his
Silver
head
Elf's
slightly.
movement was so
The female
subtle that
voice in
almost
his
no one
mind was
noticed
low
it.
and mature.
Romaine was
and
a
he
little
recognized
startled
that
and
it
looked
was
at
Orpheus's
Misha's
gratefully
voice.
before she
In
took the
fact,
silk.
the female knight who came from the era of the
Brando
War of the
noticed
Holy
his
Saints
aide's
did not
actions and
take
shook
the
his head
initiative
with
to
a wry
contact him
smile.
often.
Before
She
I
would
came
only
here,
answer
he
Brando
said,
when he had
"I
doubts
mean
about
that night."
swordsmanship. His words
Lady
silenced
Kaya?
the scene.
He asked.
Almost everyone
If
remembered
Brando
that
had
night
heard
that made their
Orpheus's
blood
voice
boil.
earlier,
It was
he
as
would
if
have
they
suddenly
only
had
had
a great
realized
hope
what they
that
had
this
done a
woman
long
came
time
from
after the
of the
incident.
War of the Holy
They had
Saints.
killed the rightful
In her
lord
era,
of
the
Erewhon
power
under
of
the
darkness and
instigation of a
chaos
young
was
man.
far stronger than
No
in
one
this
had
era.
ever thought of such a
Orpheus
thing in the
was no
past,
stranger
and no
to
one
terms
dared to
like
think
the blood
about
of
it.
God and tree
But what they
herders.
could not believe
She
was
even
that
knew
they
more
really
about
did
them
it.
than Brando.
It did not matter
But
if they
Brando
were
was a
provoked,
careful person
incited,
and had
or
already
threatened.
considered this
In
point.
short, there was no
In
turning
fact,
back.
on the way here,
Since
he
then,
had
a month
contacted
had passed
Orpheus
in
in
the
his
blink of an
mind,
eye,
hoping to
but they
get
did
help
not
from her.
collapse like they had
Unfortunately,
feared.
the problem
Now
he
that the
faced
city
was
wall
also
was
a problem
completed,
for Orpheus.
it seemed to symbolize
Scarlett's
something.
life was already
Perhaps
damaged,
under the leadership
and it was
of
the
this
blood
young
of
man,
God that
they
repaired
were
her
indeed
body.
different from
In
the
this
ordinary
situation,
rioters.
Orpheus told
As for
Brando
the
that there
final
were only
result,
two ways to
since this
solve the
young lord
problem
was
once
so
and for
confident,
all.
what
The
else
first
did they
was
have
the
to worry
miracle
about?
spell of the holy word.
You know, I actually
This
did
spell
not
could
think too
almost
much
reverse
about what
the
I
law,
wanted to do,
and it could even
Brando
restore
continued.
Medisha to the
Perhaps
state
in your
before she
eyes
was
I am a
possessed by the
noble,
blood
high
of
and
God.
mighty, but I do
But
not
then
think
again,
so.
ever since
He
the
said
start
this
of the War of the
sincerely.
Holy Saints,
Of course, how
apart
many
from
people
Saint
would believe
Farnese,
this truth?
there had never
was
been a
another
second
matter.
person who could
I
use
came
this
here
spell.
to go further
The
south
second
to
method
inherit
was
a
even
piece
more
of land that
ridiculous.
belongs to me.
The method
It came
Orpheus
from my
told him was
ancestors.
to find the covenant
Brando
of
said
Martha.
half truthfully,
The covenant
half
of Martha,
falsely,
as
I
the
did
name
not intend to
suggested,
kill
was
anyone
a
or
promise
take over
between
their
mortals
land.
and Martha.
But in the education
Since
I
the other
received,
party of the
there was
promise
a voice
the mother
that told
of
me
all
that the
Martha,
meaning of the
then the
existence
number
of
of
nobles
wishes
was
that
to
could
leave
be
the people
fulfilled
out
was
of their
almost
predicament.
limitless.
Because
This
they
could
were
be said
better,
to be an
received
enhanced
more
version of the
education,
miracle spell.
and because they had this
If the miracle
responsibility,
spell could save
power
Scarlett,
and
then it was
responsibility are
self-evident.
equal. I believe you are
Unfortunately,
familiar with
the
this
flaw
saying.
of this method was
Brando
that the
said.
possibility of it
He
being
nodded.
realized was infinitely
That's right.
small.
This is what the
Although
late King
Orpheus
Eric
told
said.
Brando that the covenant of
He
Martha
reached
did
out and
exist,
pointed at everyone.
Brando had never heard
Nobility
of it
appearing
appearing
in history or in the game. Strength is
in the
responsibility.
game, there were tens of millions
Power
of
is
players exploring this world,
Power
and
is
there were countless
responsibility.
powerful beings.
Before this,
If even they could
Brando
not find
continued,
any clues about
the
the covenant
surroundings
of
were
Martha,
silent.
then how could
Everyone
he?
looked at him,
However,
not
even
understanding
Orpheus
why
could not
this
come
young
up with a
lord
better
would say
idea
such a
after
thing at this
rejecting
time.
both of them.
Amandina
But this
also
time,
looked at
the
him,
heroic
and there was a
spirit's
strange
voice
light
gave
in her
Brando
eyes.
some hope. The spirit of the late ancient knight would not take the initiative to contact him unless it was an emergency. The most about this young lord. I've taken a look. It was as if there was a fatal attraction that could make a girl's eyes shine. For more than 12 hours. It was snowing. Her illness is beyond cure. The snowflakes were faint at first, she replied. Almost undetectable, 12 hours like cold rain falling on people's faces. But when he heard Orpheus' confirmation, his heart sank again. Tanajo did not have heavy snow in a year. The heroic spirit of everyone raised their heads. There's no way to cure the root cause. Brando also shook his head. Gray sky. You mean you can cure cloud symbolizing the coming war? Was stunned when she heard his answer. I have never been a lord, even if I had the experience. It would take a lot of effort to save this girl's life. Amandina is the same, and that was when she was in her best condition and not in her current state. As I said, she could not do anything in her current state. The snowflakes fall on his shoulders. Brando and Butchie, she had already done her best. We are all here to learn how to face very harsh for a pure spiritual being like her. Brando said, after all, everything that is not as familiar to us, sanctum, everything between fantasy and realities. Brando nodded. Perhaps we will not. There's a stupid way. Learning how to walk with difficulty. A stupid way. The young man waved his hand. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, The
Please go to
problem is,
www.
his voice became a little louder, and his eyes swept across everyone's faces. Do you have the courage to support the original that is coming, to realize that what we have done may seem insignificant?
Chapter 339.
But it is the glory of the previous era. Do you see? When Seal closed the door and came in from outside, the late King Eric's words have already confirmed all of this, out of the blue. To ignore the darkness, and Medisha, to let your actions be without shame, even though they did not hold on to such a dream. Was talking to himself. Whether it is they understood what he promised, the responsibility of a man, saying that you have a way to save to his people. Amandina was the first to ask. Just as I am standing here, Medisha was a step slower than her. I answer your questions like this. The silver elf girl turned to look at Scarlet, who was lying on the bed. He pointed at everyone for a moment and decided not to say anything. Cornelius, Rabin, Brando shook his head, and even the numerous mercenary commanders. He stopped talking to Orthless in his mind and said to the others. The white breath he exhaled melted into a thin layer of white mist in the snow, making this young man, who usually didn't seem very reliable, if there is a day when you become a new noble of Erewhon, the blood of God's tenacity is beyond your imagination. Are you willing to remember that being a noble is a responsibility? It is not an ordinary thing. The young man's words were sonorous and powerful, piercing through the cold of the early winter, quietly on the bed, but all that was heard was a dead silence. Not to mention that Scarlet had already died once. He did not reversing the cycle of life and death is a great behind the young man's words. If not for the blood of God's cavalry looked back at his companions with a stiff expression. But everyone understood what he meant. Cornelius was also oblivious to his surroundings. So there's no other way. Or rather, it should be said that the middle-aged man's heart was pounding. Seal her into a car. Of course he knew what Brando meant by those words. Were not surprised. This young man was telling them in public. One of them had seen Brando sealing card with her own eyes, my retainers, and the other had experienced it herself. Share honor and disgrace. But the sealing card is not omnipotent. You are my knight. It can only keep the target in the state and turn them into a summoned creature. For me. He paused for a moment. At that moment, let's not talk about the fact that this is man who had been a mercenary for decades. The young man looked at energy in his heart for the first time. The elven girl did not mind. There was a kind of energy that could be described as boiling blood. My lord, this is Medissa's own choice. He felt that the opportunity he had been waiting for so many years was right in front of him. My lord, you should ask her face to face. All the mercenaries present felt the same. I don't think she will refuse. Perhaps only Medissa and Scarlet didn't feel anything. Brando to them, it was enough as long as they followed this young lord. Scarlet's dependence on him, did not need to think too much. But he did not know why such a strong girl would be so weak. Brando was the only person trusted by someone makes me feel responsible. I promised her at the bottom of the chagrined mind that I already knew what Brando was thinking, and I cannot go back on my word. Took a light breath. Moreover, it was the only one who understood the hidden meaning in Brando's words. He thought for a moment and shook his head. This young man wanted to change the rules of risky method until the last moment. He wanted to inject new blood into the old noble system. Amandina asked in confusion. Amandina did not know if she had heard wrongly. Sealing a card of fate is not without risk. She did not understand why a young noble with almost no foundation would turn them into majestic ideals and beliefs. Perhaps it had already turned into a force that could shake people's hearts. So even if she is sealed as a card, knew that she understood. There is a high chance that this was the first time she saw the outline of this plan, and she was already deeply immersed in vain. She opened her mouth slightly and took a light with him a long time ago, but she did not know how to respond. So he was the one who was most aware of it. Amandina stood there in a daze. But it's better than having no chance at all, isn't it? Please give me some support. Amandina frowned. $12,000 is really a waste of money. Don't be impatient, Amandina. If you want to know what will happen Brando next, looked at her and please go to www. No one here said that we can't do anything. It's just that it's not the last moment. Support the author. The last moment? Support the original reading. Calm down. My lord, you mean there's still a chance? I said before there's Chapter a stupid 346. Stupid the year method. The War of the Black Rose. The transformation broke out. The winter was the blood of gods will always take over the body before devouring frozen the air into fine powder. Brando looked at the red-haired girl on the bed. Gerd had been hiding in the bushes at the top of the mountain for the whole night and was almost frozen stiff. This is because the blood of God to catch the powder taken over the power of the body, and a trace of coldness appeared in his palm as the Shire and Medisha listened carefully and did not express any objections. Gert, who was still wearing his green flux major while the other was a silver raised his head and was born in a time of war. It was snowing. They were already familiar with the mysterious knowledge passed down among the Magi. He couldn't help but recall the frequent conversations between the county and the young overlord. Even though she was knowledgeable about the situation limited to history, the alliance of the Grand Duke, and some magical knowledge of the princess. She listened for a while and could not help but until after the first snow. What do you mean? Gert was only a child of a small aristocratic has a part of the power. His hometown was originally a warrior, which was also considered to becoming a silver-ranked warrior. Although he was a noble, his knowledge was limited, and at most he could only watch the blood of gods was implanted into her body. His life was better than an ordinary strength of a gold-ranked warrior. But in recent years, the situation had been worsening year after year. Gods gave up in order to fuse with his heart that the reason he transferred a part of its power into this body. He had studied magic under a wizard mentor for a period of time and had interacted with his mentor to understand the outside world. allowing the body to
world of this
gradually
era
adapt
had a
to the
fatal
new
attraction
power.
for a young man like
Brando
him.
explained,
The chaos
and seemed to
fact,
be
this
full
is
of
the power that
opportunities.
carries the aura
Thus,
of the blood
after
of
his
gods.
mentor passed away,
Because all
Gert
of this is
embarked
done
on the
under
journey
the
of his
guidance of the
dreams.
original soul
However,
of the body,
his luck was
which
not
is
as
also
good as he
done
thought
under
it would
Scarlet's
be.
guidance.
Two of the
Her body
companions
will
he
not
met who were of
reject this
similar
power.
background died
Brando
during the journey.
continued,
But
they
they
had
had
no
no
choice
choice
but
but
to
to
rest
rest
for a
and
while
interrupt
and
Ferber Hill
what
before
if Scarlet
deciding whether
chose
to
to
reject
return or
this power
continue
in
the
the
journey?
first place?
But he hadn't
Impossible,
expected
she
that
was
Groton
already
would
dead
kill
at that
all
time.
his companions.
The Shire
The
continued.
disheartened Gert
Moreover,
only wanted
under
to
such
stay
a great
behind
power,
and perish
most
together
people
with
would
the
not
noble.
have the chance to
But
resist.
sometimes fate
And
was
even if they
fickle.
succeeded,
On that
it would
night,
only
he
be a
met the
matter
young
of mutual
overlord and
destruction.
participated in the
Seeing
battle.
Brando nod in
He was
agreement,
fortunate enough to
Amanda
follow him
suddenly
and
felt
became
a
the
chill
first
run
member
down
of
her
the
spine.
county's wizard regiment.
Although she had
As the
always
Shire's
heard of
deputy,
terrifying
he had
rumors
the
about the
opportunity
tree
to
herders and the
participate in the
unifying
discussion
guild,
between
but in her
Brando
heart,
and the wizard's
these stories
choir.
were just legends.
Of course, he was too
In
young
her
to
eyes,
join in.
these
The two men
organizations
talked
were
about the
perhaps no
situation
different
in the
from the
north,
bandits and
the
robbers
invasion of the
outside
Black
city.
Rose of Bramanto,
But until
and Cruz.
today, the Shire
It was
and
as if
Brando's
Gretel had
descriptions
seen a
gave
whole
her a
new
more
world,
intuitive
a height
understanding
he had
of
never
these two
imagined
organizations
before.
for the first
It was
time.
also something
This
that his
is too
first
much.
mentor had never discussed with him.
Amandina frowned and was
At
a
that
little
moment,
puzzled.
Gert
Why
knew
would
that
they
he
do
had
such a
grasped
thing?
the opportunity to
Brando
realize his
shrugged.
dream.
There is no
Or rather,
purpose as
he had
far as
already
I know.
realized it.
They are just going
Since
against
then,
all
he had become a loyal
civilizations.
supporter of Brando.
He waved his hand.
This time,
All
he
right,
had
back to the
volunteered to
topic
come
at
to
hand.
Paulus to gather
When Scarlet's
information.
body gradually accepts this power,
However,
the divine
it just
blood
so
will
happened
awaken,
that the scout
and at
team
this
needed
time,
a talent
it will
who was
take back
proficient
the
in
power
magic
that
so he was
originally
naturally
belonged to
selected.
Scarlet, and then
The Shire
Scarlet's.
had complained to Brando
Finally,
about this,
there is the
saying
power
that he
of
had
life
taken
itself.
away one of his
Brando's
capable
voice
assistants.
lowered.
But when the
Gert
life
didn't
is
regret his
exhausted, the whole
decision.
process is
He
complete.
felt that rather than staying
Scarlet
by
is now
roadside,
in his
he
final
might as
stage.
well attract his attention
Amandina
with his
bit her
actions.
lips. Then,
He
my
was a
lord,
person
what
who
is the
yearned for
stupid
adventure.
method you speak of?
Otherwise, he wouldn't have
It is
left
actually
home to
very
come
simple.
The
Brando
young man
replied.
stared at the sky
Since the
for
whole
a long
process
time
will
and finally
only
came
end when
back
the
to his
power of life
senses.
is exhausted.
Then he rubbed
Then
his
the
hands.
stupid method is
He
to
didn't dare to
constantly
make too much
replenish the
noise in
potential
case
of
he
life that has
attracted
been
the attention
consumed.
of the sentries below.
Amandina was slightly
From the top of the
startled,
hill,
and then
her
he looked
eyes
down
lit
at
up
the
as if
gray
she
shell
saw hope.
tents and the
Then,
bustling
my lord,
campsites
how do
in the
we
forest
replenish
below.
it?
Then
The
he heard
divine
a
blood
rustling sound
transforms
behind
power
him.
very quickly.
His companions
And if this
were on
power is
guard in that
converted into
direction.
actual
The
consumption,
sound clearly
I'm
belonged
afraid
to
that
one of their
Scarlet
own.
would need to eat the
Of course,
entire
there was
output
another
of Tonajil for a
possibility.
year to
Gert
replenish this
immediately
amount.
tensed up.
The Shire did
Why?
a little calculation,
Cabbage? And then
a
said a
strange
joke that
password
was not
came
so
from
funny.
the forest.
How is
It
that
was
possible?
said that the Shire had taught them.
Amandina was stunned.
Gert immediately
It is
relaxed.
indeed impossible,
Was one
but
of
the
their
other
own.
method is to use
He
holy
turned
water.
around and replied,
Brando replied,
"Rough,
if we
who
have
is
enough
it?"
holy water.
Gert
We have some
recognized the
reserves
name.
of holy water.
It was another wizard's
Amandina
apprentice
frowned.
in the same team.
The holy water
Melf
that she
only had
found
a
from
nickname and
Groton's
no
personal
name.
stash was
The Shire
originally
had
meant
given
to be
him
used
that
in the
name.
next battle.
What a lucky
But for the
bastard.
sake of her
Gert
companions,
couldn't
she
help
could
but
only
think.
reluctantly give it up.
How is it, Gert?
How much do you
Is
need?
this the camp of the
We
night
need at
Lord
least
Paulus?
1,300
The wizard's
bottles
apprentice
of
who
number
was
7
wearing a
holy
grey
water.
robe
Walked
That-
over and crouched down
much.
beside Gert.
Amandina was
He
stunned.
whispered, but
the
Mouse and
Shire's
the others
next
said that
words
there
made
is
her
no camp
completely
here.
lose her strength.
This is not Lord
Every
Paulus'
day.
camp.
Gert
Gert
shook his head.
Amandina
It's
finally
not.
understood the
Melf
problem.
was stunned.
After
The
saying
young
so
man
much,
slowly
doesn't it
nodded
mean
and
that there
moved
is
his
no other
frozen
way?
limbs.
This time,
They are
not only the
Highlanders.
Shire, even
Highlanders.
Medisha nodded.
Aren't
In
they
fact,
fighting with
she knew
Lord
from the
Pallas?
start that this method
Mayhew
would not
asked in
work,
surprise.
but she did not know
What are
why
they doing
Brando
here?
would bring it up at
Are
this
they
time.
planning to invade
This
us
young
now?
lord didn't
Then
seem
the
like
heavens
someone
are
who
helping
liked to
us.
talk nonsense.
But Gert shook his
But
head.
just as the
It was
silver
not
elf
that
was
simple.
puzzled, a weak
There are
cough
many
came
groups
from the
of
bed and
Highlanders.
immediately
They
attracted
might be coming
everyone's
for us.
attention.
What?
Everyone turned their heads
you
and saw
sure?
the red-haired
Of
girl
course
lying
I'm
on
sure.
the bed slowly
I know
opening
them better
her
than
eyes.
you.
All right, go send a message
Scarlet
to the
felt as if
receiving
she had
team.
just woken up
We are
from a
preparing
nightmare.
to retreat. Her body
Gert
was
replied.
drenched in sweat,
It's
and
snowing.
it took her a while
We
to
can't
regain
hide
her
here
senses.
anymore.
She
have to
then
change
weakly
our
turned her
clothes.
head and looked at
Melf
Brando
looked
and
at
his
his daze.
companions and nodded.
Who is this? Highlanders?
This young man's face
The
is
snowflakes in
unfamiliar
the
yet
sky
familiar.
became denser.
It's my lord. Not long after they left the
Scarlet
south
blinked her
gate,
eyes and
Brando
suddenly bumped into a mercenary. This was the young man who told her softly that he would never leave her alone. The young man recognized him. She would never forget that answer, just like how she would never forget Makarov's answer. The Shire had selected those who had the ability to cast spells from the mercenaries and adventurers, and the other was a man who she had a relationship with for more than 10 years. Swindlers, who was both her father and teacher, who pretended to be mysterious, felt a little dazed. A large number of apprentices. She laid on the bed without any strength in her body. It was as if there was a demon shadow in her head that could drag her down into the dark abyss at any time. Many wizards even volunteered to leave their mercenary groups to join this wizard group. Although she knew that she was criticized by the leaders of the mercenary groups, it was as quiet as when she first came behind and did not cause any real trouble. Was not worried at all. Brando knew that the advantage of having a group of spellcasters was proven by both players and NPCs in the later stages of the last bit of consciousness. Of course, the Shire she did not even know what she was holding on to. These people did not deserve to be called a wizard. She suddenly understood. It was not the red-haired girl to have a mixture of people from all walks of life, and a drop of crystal clear tear rolled out of her eye the moment she laid eyes on him. This was the first Adept Legion under his command that had taken shape, and her voice was almost inaudible. There were many talented individuals among these people. Try to start uploading with some training characters' attributes as soon as the Wizard Association in the future. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, Shire had the strength of a mentor, he did not have the experience of grooming apprentices. There are more chapters. Thus, this wizard group was still an empty shell. Reading. However, it was not completely useless. These spellcasters who had a little bit of strength had more or less followed a mentor and stared blankly at apprentices for a period of time. The room was silent. There were even some who came from academies. They all had one thing in common, and the Shire and that was that they were all literate. Amandina looked left and right, and finally looked at her lord with suspicion. And the Shire used these spellcasters to deal with the dark underworld of Shaflund. It was obvious that this person was one of the Nightsong Tigers. She naturally did not understand what Brando meant to Scarlet at Brando's question. The Elementalist nodded, could see that she was attached to Brando. The Shire she could not help tell you that you might need this information. Brando walked closer and stood beside Scarlet's bed. By those people in the north stopped her weakness, and it said that it has something to do with the Highlanders. A weak smile those people in the north still hanging from Brando was stunned for a moment. It was before he remembered that he did, but it was as fragile as if it was drawn on a infiltrate the polished region to gather information about Count Randner's army. The Nightsong Tiger was fully in charge of this matter, but she had not eaten anything for several days and relied on drinking water to stay alive. Wizards or apprentices from the mercenaries she could barely make the scout team to disguise themselves as adventurers so that they could send back information to the Scarlet's condition. The method of sending back information was simple. What about Shafland's work? But he was the one who came up with this method himself. Scarlet looked at him silently. Animal messengers. Brando smiled. Of course, this was not a new method. Did you come back to see me, my lord? Long before the eyes expressed her question, the crew's people had already used this method to send back information during the November War. However, in this era, very few people thought of sending wizards to the front lines, so this method was not widely spread, and she frowned slightly as if she was in pain just lying there. The first demonic wave came a few years later, and the room was so quiet that even a pin drop could be heard. The number of talented wizards increased day by day. The red-haired girl turned her head to the other side and stared blankly at the lush branches of the mangrove tree outside the window as she asked softly. There was a more stable alternative method, and nodded, such as using magical tools. When have I ever lied to anyone? Brando did not have the means to do so he thought Scarlet was stunned for a moment. With the animal messenger, an apprentice could send a message within a day and a night. Spoke in a soft, feminine voice. In theory, the message could be sent back one by one tone made everyone's heart soften. In the past, the message would take a week to reach stubborn girl, but now it would only take a few minutes. It was as if the pain of the past few days had completely disintegrated the strength that she had been supporting for so long. Especially those who had the ability to cast spells and were familiar with scouting techniques. No one had the ability to answer this question. The Nightsong Tiger and the Shire only had 2 or 3 scouts. Actually, their surveillance of the polished green territory was still quite limited. And Brendel did not expect that they would obtain useful information so quickly with this level of surveillance. She took a deep breath and said, it seemed that the nobles still looked down on these rioters. Even I don't think perhaps they paid enough attention to the rioters in the war. If Makarov was here, the Lord he would have realized that he had never paid attention to his adopted daughter's smile. Even though Brando did not have many men, his methods were much better than Erwin's rigor and took a step forward. Even though he did not have the self-awareness to do so, the usually quiet soldiers like Lord Paulus would have a headache dealing with them. Scarlet's words made her to the front lines as scouts, but Brando waved his hand. In the eyes of the nobles, this was not something a human would do. Made a decision only Brando, who was used to this method, raised his head slightly and asked softly, when he first proposed this idea, not only the conservative Amandina, but even Scarlet was slightly stunned. To be continued, even though she said such stubborn words, she did not want to leave www. Otherwise, she would not have gritted her teeth to read more chapters. Even though every day was like hell, she still waited for the young lord to return, because he told her that he would bring her with him. No matter what, he would not leave her behind. However, after a series of discussions, her heart, Brando came to the conclusion that using the Magi as the front line was a crazy idea. The Magi were not only useful in sending back information, but also in told her that she could do it, but in the end, the answer she received was that she could not do it. Even so, the Shire only supported the idea of using the Magi in the early stages of the war. Scarlet wondered if she was being too greedy. The enemy understood the Magi's strategy, that others couldn't do. The Magi's losses would be clearly given her sincere feelings, Brando could only accept the Shire's reasoning. She felt as if her heart had been stabbed with a knife. He knew that the Shire was not wrong, and he was not wrong either. The red-haired girl looked at him, it was just that the time was not right. And the largest demonic wave in history was not here yet. Difficulty. Brando glanced at the mercenary who delivered the letter. She took a breath to adjust her emotions. And opened it, but his expression 3 times, but the last time she choked out. Dark clouds in my hometown there is a tradition, and it was even uglier that when a person dies this time of the year, their closest relatives will kiss their forehead. And the elven princess looked at each other worriedly. Even if they go to another world, they will not with such a serious expression. She looked at Brendel helplessly. Did something happen? She could not bring herself to hate him, this hateful liar, and Brando shook his head. The letter was very simple, she said. It only stated that a clan of Highlanders had appeared in Lord Paulus' territory. Even if
it could be said that if this letter was in the hands of any of Brando's subordinates,
she used all her
strength
to lie back down. The term
Highlanders
herself in a
was
daze,
commonly used in Randner's territory,
and everyone
these natives
were
constantly
at war
with
Erwin and the other
heard this and turned her
outsiders.
head away.
Lord Paulus had been
hard
dealing
as
with
if
them
she
for
did
more
not
than
want to
half
see
of
what
his
would
life.
happen next.
If someone else saw this letter,
and the Shire's
they would
eyes
probably
fell
be
on
glad
Brando.
that the old knight
Brando
was in trouble
silent
again.
for a moment.
However, this
Then he
letter
nodded.
had a different meaning
After
in
Scarlet
Brando's
lost
eyes.
her last bit of support,
It seems that we have to add a new list of enemies
she
to
did
our
not
list.
see Brando nod.
The young lord
But in her
smiled
daze,
helplessly
she still
and passed
wanted
the
to
letter
laugh,
to Medisa,
but she did not even
but
have
the
the
elven
strength to
princess
laugh.
only took a
What
glance
a
at it
failure.
and asked after
She
a
could
moment
not
of
help but
surprise
think that her life
what's
was
the
a
matter?
failure.
She wanted
Highlanders,
to protect
they
others,
aren't
but she
Count
was
Randner's
unable to
enemies.
do so. My lord,
She
you
wanted
said
to
that
rely
Knight
on
Paulus
others,
has
but
been
in the
fighting
end,
against
she
them
was
for
abandoned.
years.
Why
She
would
was
they
so
join
sad
him
that
in
she wanted to
attacking us?
cry.
But she
Medisha
could not
asked in
cry.
confusion.
Close your
The
eyes,
Highlanders are
Scarlet.
divided into many
Brando
tribes.
said softly.
The tribe
The
mentioned
girl
in
was
the letter
stunned
came from the east of
then
Mount
she became
Greyheart,
quiet,
and they have always
she
been
thought
under
that at
Count
least Lady
Randner's
Martha
rule
saw
and
her
name.
small existence
However,
in
the
the end.
Highlanders have a
She
strong sense of
obediently closed
territory,
her eyes,
and they rarely
but
move
this
to
was
other
her last
regions on a
wish.
large scale, much less
She
leave
did
their
not want to
dominion.
leave behind
Then,
any regrets.
Scarlet
She
didn't know
closed
much
her
about
eyes and seemed
military
to hear the
affairs,
sound of the
but she
wind
could tell
blowing
that
in the
something was
mountains
wrong
of
with
Chablis.
Brando's tone.
She grew up listening to
I don't
this
think
sound.
they're here for the
This was
slumber
the homeland of
celebration.
the mountain people.
I don't know what
the place where
promised
all
these
her
stubborn
dreams
fellows,
began and
but
ended.
I'm sure they're here for
Scarlet
us.
suddenly felt
It
a
doesn't
sense
matter.
of peace in her heart.
Scarlet snorted
She
softly.
thought that she had
It
finally
doesn't matter
returned
who
to this
comes,
place.
we will defeat
In this
them.
quiet
When
forest,
Brando
she had
heard
grown
this,
up
he
with
could only
everyone.
smile.
Every single one
He
of them
knew
was
that this
so clear.
red-haired girl was
Each
just cheering
leader
him on.
and the carefree time had returned to her side.
On the other hand,
But she still
Medisha
raised her
was
head
calmer.
slightly
Is
and
it a big
stubbornly
problem?
waited for the kiss
She
that
asked.
contained another piece
Brando
of
shook
memory.
his head.
It was
Of
a
course
signal
it will
to
increase
bid
the
farewell.
pressure on us,
but she
but it's
waited
hard
for
to
a
say
long
how
time.
much.
It was
I
as if
believe
the
that
world
old
did not
Fox
move
Count
and
Randner
time
has
has mobilized more
but
than
it
one
did not
Highlander
come.
tribe.
Scarlet
He
wanted
looked
to
into
open
the
her
distance,
eyes,
but
the
she did
snow
not
had
know
already
if she
turned
had
the
the strength
streets
to
into
do
a
so.
hazy fog.
But at this
It
moment
seems
she
like
heard
I've
a gentle
underestimated
voice.
these
Don't
beasts
move.
who fight
The
all day
red-haired girl
long.
closed her
Even
eyes
though
and
Brando
trembled
said it
slightly.
casually,
Her
he was
face
not
and ears
confident
turned
in his
red.
heart.
Who
Is it
knew how
coming?
many Highlanders
She
would
thought.
enter Paulus?
But at this moment
perhaps
she
the
felt
supply
something
of
cold
food to
touch
these
her
people would
lips.
be a bottleneck.
Scarlet let
However,
out a low cry
Brando
from the
did not
depths
know
of her
how
heart.
long Count Randner
If she
would
could
be
she
able
would
to mobilize
definitely feel her
resources
ears.
in his territory.
No, the roots of her
In any
ears
case,
burning.
Lord Paulus's army,
How
the
could he
Highlanders,
kiss
and the
there?
undead of
There?
Madara. There are so
The
many
young man
people
could
in the
not
house.
help but frown
The
deeply.
red-haired girl felt
Should
that
we
she was
inform
going to
Miss
die,
Amandina?
but not from
Medisha
the blood
asked.
of God.
She
Brando
was
shook
going to
his
die
head.
from embarrassment.
Amandina was left
Scarlet
behind
froze
at the
for a moment.
south gate.
She
She
did
was
not know what to
responsible
do.
for
Her
supervising
brain
the
seemed to have
mercenaries
turned
as
to
they
stone.
paid the workers.
Her heart was
The
thumping
wages
in
were
her chest.
calculated using the
That
copper
sound had
coins
never
of the
been so
Freeport,
strong and clear.
and each person only
But wait.
received a few copper
Scarlet's
coins.
bashful
It was not a
movement
lot,
stopped.
but it was better
She
than
tried
nothing.
to take a breath.
It could be said that
Strong
the
and
symbolic
clear?
meaning was greater. It had been a long time
Amandina's
since she could
original
think so
intention
clearly.
was to save the
All
money,
the pain had
but it was
stopped,
part of the
and
Romans'
she felt
plan
as
to
if her
revive the
vitality
city.
had returned to
She
her
naturally
body.
could not agree
The
to
feeling
it.
of powerlessness
In the end,
that made it
Amandina
difficult for
could
her
not
to
take
even
it
breathe
anymore
had
and
disappeared
simply
without a
dragged the
trace.
young man to the
She could
construction
clearly
site.
feel a warm
When he
current
thought of this,
entering her body
Brando
from her
could not
mouth.
help but smile
It
and
slid
shake
down
his
her
head
small
despite
tongue
his
into
heavy
her
heart.
throat, and then spread
He
to her
recalled
limbs
how
and
little
bones.
Romaine pretended
This power
not to
seemed
know
to
and
be
tried
able
to
to heal
heal
her
her
pain and pull her out of the
but in
abyss
the
of
end,
suffering.
she was dragged
Scarlet
back by
was
the
stunned.
noblewoman's order.
She subconsciously
Amandina
reached
was
out to
different
touch
from
her
him.
face. Even
Although
if she
she had
pretended
not
to be
opened her eyes,
teary-eyed, she would
but
not
this
be
inner
moved.
surprise only
Even though
lasted for a
Amandina was
moment,
probably
and then it was
Romain's best
replaced
friend
by
other
another
than
kind of
Freya,
embarrassment.
Amandina was probably
No matter
Romain's
what, that
closest
guy
friend.
can't kiss me.
But when it came to
How
official
could he do
matters,
that?
Amandina would
Scarlet's
not give
face
him
turned
any
red
face.
again, like a
Whenever
lovely
he thought
red
of the
apple.
young man who
And
always
in
gave him a
front of so
headache
many
and was
people,
helpless in front of
and
Amandina,
he even put some
Brando
strange
felt that
things
it was
in her
very
mouth.
interesting. The
At
red-haired
that time,
girl
he
felt
was
that
glad
she could
that he
not think
avoided
about
the
it
young
anymore.
woman quickly.
She lowered her head
Otherwise, the young
slightly,
man would
feeling as if
definitely
her
blame
body
it on
was
him.
burning.
She wanted
Amandina
to
might
find
be
a
able
hole
to
to
keep her
hide in
promise to
immediately,
others,
but
but
she
she closed
not do anything to this young lord. She would rather die than open them. He shook his head and returned to the matter at hand. The young man patted the letter in his hand. She heard a burst of laughter. I want to know who sent this information back. This laughter was like the last straw that broke the bowstring, causing Most people probably would not pay attention to these Highlanders because they are too common in his Falern's faces. In other words, they had to hold back their laughter. The person who sent this information back for the Shire must have thought as well. The young wizard was a little silver elf princess. He knew this because he had knowledge and vision that surpassed this world. It was a golden apple. Brando expressionlessly placed the apple on the Shire about some things related to this matter. His mood was different. He was afraid that even the Shire would not be happy at all because the powerful vitality and other than him and the Shire could only prolong Scarlet's life. But it could not change the person who sent this letter back. On the other hand, Brando was strengthened the divine blood in her body. He noticed that the elementalist in front of him was looking at him. The legend said that the golden apple could change a person's fate. The young man was slightly startled and asked, "That it could change Scarlet's fate. Is there anything else?" This was a last resort. And the elementalist expression was a little strange, there was something strange in the apple. Just he thought that even though it was not poison, it could not be anything good for you. But at this moment, the letter, Scarlett's face was burning with a frown. Even Brando looked at the girl with a strange expression. My lord, do you want to see it? He thought that a person's face could be so red. Brando said in a bad mood. Female dragon's since it was said that it was for him, but he did not think that Scarlett's only thought at this moment was to find a piece of cheese and kill herself. No matter how he looked at it, that she had made a mistake, and this was not the most embarrassing thing. The most embarrassing thing was that her reaction became even more strange. Amandina, my lord, can you turn around? I'm going to die. Turn around? Scarlett thought. What kind of play is this? She had long forgotten before about the Brando could react in her body. He saw the shadow of a spear flash. There hasn't been much support recently. Scarlett had already stretched out her spear and placed it on the elementalist's neck. Take it out, Chidian. Scarlett said coldly. There are more chapters. The elementalist support the author, or rather the original read frightened. Then, with a trembling but bitter face, he took out a strange creature from under his robe. Scarlett was saved. It was his familiar. It was like a miracle. Brando only needed a glance to recognize the strange creature after a long time. So did the others. Before this, it was only a duck. No one thought that Brando would have a way to save Scarlett from such a dangerous situation. Not only Brando, but also Scarlett and Medisha were stunned. This young and mysterious lord was omnipotent. One was an experienced player. Was certain one was the princess after thinking about it countless times, and one was a mercenary who had participated in many battles in a daze and felt like she was dealt with all kinds of wizards. But when she saw Scarlett holding the golden apple in her hands and smiling they had seen all kinds of strange people, they were still quite different. Help but sigh in her heart. But they had never seen a wizard who used a duck as a familiar. Amandina shook her head. Brando was stunned for a while. She knew that Scarlett was going to sell herself to help Brando count the money. As far as he knew, when the Shire told everyone that the golden apple was the legendary golden apple, she wasn't the only one who was shocked. Most elementalists Scarlett was even more stunned as if she was struck by lightning. My lord, the golden apple almost fell from her hands and rolled to the ground. This has nothing to do with me. If it wasn't for Medisha's quick reaction, this thing would probably be the first golden apple by the Lord of the Shire. He said that using a duck as a familiar can bring golden apple in a daze as if she was hugging the most precious treasure in the world. Only helplessly shake his head. Knew that this girl was completely hopeless. This was the first time he looked at this guy carefully. Just like Medisha, in fact, this guy was just a young man about the same age as him, and he looked quite reliant on others. This girl who looked strong seemed to always saw this guy take out a duck as a familiar, but she understood that this guy was very funny no matter how he looked at it. She could only rely on herself. If this guy was born in his time, he would have been a comedian. The eyes of others would rarely linger on others. Scarlett was fine, not to mention nobles like Medisha also seemed to find it funny. Their footsteps would never stop for even a moment unless they called for their own benefits. Scarlett's efforts were destined to be unrequited in my hometown. If she could see this clearly like the other members of the magical beast that was over level 30, perhaps she would feel better. It had a fierce temper, but she was still Scarlett, so not many people were willing to deal with it. Amandina glanced at Brendel again and thought to herself that she was lucky to have such an oddball like him as her follower. I happen to need an apprentice, benevolent and full of humanity. An apprentice. Brando's actions seemed to be out of tune with the world of nobles. My lord, are you a wizard? But to say that this young man was not a noble, Brando shook his head. Amandina herself could not convince herself. Anyway, other than nobles, she had never seen a person as knowledgeable and magnanimous as Brando. The elementalist was stunned again. Everything seemed to indicate that this young man was not only a noble presence, but also had an extraordinary family background. They would have an innate sense of oppression towards low-level existences, who was captured from the mines. But he did not feel such oppression from this young lord at all. There was only one possibility, and that was that this young lord's strength was weaker than his own, or was about the same as his own. She knew every single one of Count Rander's most outstanding knights dare to think about this possibility. For the sake of Brando's plan, she had been doing the legendary lord who was said to be omnipotent. Born in a knight's family. He had only participated in the November few times before, but he had long heard of the mysterious and powerful legends of this lord many times. All of these nobles knew about him. But wasn't this lord a gold-ranked swordsman? He unintentionally revealed his attitude towards Brando, the young man who was aroused her suspicions. Without a doubt, the old swordsman knew Brando. But Brando just waved his hand at elders, and he did need an apprentice, but not just an apprentice. Could tell that Brando's elders were not simple to prepare for his other plan. Of course, this information might be scattered and not valuable in the eyes of the Highlanders as an enemy inexplicably made Brando feel intelligent urgency. It was enough to confirm the information she knew about Brando. You will follow me from now on, and I will give you a name. Brando's identity seemed to be becoming clearer. This young man came from a noble family that had a long history, to be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, he was such a rare descendant of a noble. Amandina could not help but wonder if she was blessed by the heavens. Was that why she was able to meet the current lord in Brag's dark room? She was taken in by him, followed him, and became his aide. At least until now, she had never regretted it. Brando opened the letter. She only felt that she was extremely lucky, but there was a secret mark at the top right corner. But when she looked at the golden apple in Scarlett's hand, crumpled the letter into a ball. She still felt a little envious. Then a wisp of flame burst out from his hand and burned it to ashes. Legend had it that it could change the fate of a person or even a country. Brando looked up. It only existed in myths. The Shire had brought him good news. Before this, she did not even believe that this legend was real. This news made Brando feel relieved, but think that if this young man had such a golden apple, he could use it to bribe the most powerful followers beside him. It was a priceless treasure. I'm
With it,
here,
Brendel
the
would
youth
be able to
paused
gain
for a
the
moment
favor of
before he
anyone with
realized that
authority.
Brendel was calling
Whether
for
it was a
him.
count, a
He
marquis,
quickly
or
asked,
even a duke,
"Is
it
there
was not a
anything,
problem
my
at
lord?
all. Even
Go
the
and get
supreme
Tadgev for
emperor
me."
of the Cruz
Tadgev,
Empire, or even the grand
leader of
priest
the
of the
subterranean
Holy Cathedral
dwellers.
of Fire,
You know
if
it's in the
this young
castle
man
right
wanted,
now.
he could use this
Brando had
golden
summoned
apple to
Tadgev
exchange
to the
for almost
castle ever
anything
since
he
the
wanted.
war broke out.
But Amandina
However,
did not
the
understand.
subterranean dweller leader
Brando
was
did
quite
not.
happy.
He only
At least
used this
Groton
golden
did not
apple
give
to
it
save
such
a girl
treatment.
he had only known
As
for a few
whether
months.
Brando intended to
Perhaps
use it as a
Scarlet had the
hostage,
strength of a
Tadgev
gold-ranked
did not
fighter,
think too much
but
about it.
Amandina
It
understood
had already
that the value
sworn
of
an
a
oath to
golden
its
apple
god,
was not as
and
simple
these
as a
humans did not
gold-ranked
need
fighter.
to use it again.
Of course, if
Cover
the
it
other
with a
side of the
cloak.
equation was
Try not to
multiplied
let
by
others
100
see it,
times,
Brando
it was
said.
possible. The young
Of
man
course,
quickly
the answer
nodded.
to this question
My
was
lord,
simpler for
where do you want
Brando.
to meet it? He simply
Brando
understood
lowered
that a
his
man's
head and
wealth
whispered
was his
something
own
into
ruin.
the young man's ear.
Perhaps this noble
The young
girl
man
thought
nodded
that he had a
and glanced
huge
at his
family
lord.
behind him that could
After
shelter him from
confirming
the
that
wind
there
and
were no
rain,
more orders,
but Brando
he
knew
turned
what kind of
around and ran
situation
into
he
the
was
snow.
in.
Moreover,
Brando
he
watched
did
the
not
young
intend
man's
to have
figure
any
disappear
dealings
into
with
the
heroines
snow
before
before
he
he waved
nobles.
to the others. He was here to
Let's go
change the
somewhere
fate
else.
of this ancient country.
Scarlet looked
not
at
to be in
Brando and
cahoots
regained
with
her
them.
senses.
Brando knew
She
that he
kept
could live
comparing this
comfortably
young
in
lord's
this world
appearance
with
with
Makarov
foresight,
and
but
even
that was not his goal.
Scarlet blushed
Especially
and shook her
after
head.
seeing
Where are we
Makarov and
going,
Groton's
my lord?
performance, his
Medisha
confidence
looked
grew
at her
day
with
by day.
amusement. As for
A
the
good
golden
place.
apple, Brando did not
replied.
care. The snow was getting heavier and heavier,
If it could be
and
cured,
the streets
he did
were
not
soon
mind
covered
using
in
a
a
thin
10 or
layer of
100
white.
golden apples.
There
to
were
save
not many
Scarlet's
people
life.
on the streets,
Of course,
but
the
that was if
warm
he had
orange
it.
light from the
But
houses on
Amandina
both
did not
sides of
see
the
it that
street
way.
made them feel at
Scarlet
ease.
also did not see it
Scarlet
that
had
way.
just recovered.
The person
and this
in
was the
question
first
was
time
holding
she
the
went out
golden
this
apple
week.
in a daze.
But the girl who
She
had
knew
her
the
long
value
red
of the golden
ponytail tied
apple.
up again. When
Seemed
Brando
to
was
have returned to
negotiating
her
with
old
Makarov
life.
and the others,
She held her
saw
thunder
Fleetwood
lance and
Makarov
followed behind
and
Hugin's
Haugen
desire
while
for the
looking at the
golden
surrounding
apple.
streets with a
She could
somewhat
not help
indifferent
but
gaze.
wonder who was more
Medisha
important
had
to
always been
Makarov,
interested
her
in the
or the
human
golden
world.
apple.
She would
She did
occasionally
not need
ask
to think
Brando
about
what
the
the
answer
answer
to
to
this
this
question.
question.
The
Even
three
if
of
there
them
were
walked for a
100 of
while
her,
until they heard a
Makarov
clanking
would not
sound.
hesitate to choose the
Medisha's
golden
long
apple.
ears were the first
But
to
why
pick
did
up the
that young
sound.
man make a completely
She was
different
startled
choice?
for a moment before she
Scarlet
realized
did not
that they were
understand,
near
and she
Bosley's
looked at
forge.
Brando in confusion.
Bosley's forge was
She
right
saw
in
that he
front
was
of them.
talking to Medisha
After
and the
Brando
Shire,
bought the cold
and did not
iron
have
ores
any
from Cohen
intention of
and
turning
sent the
around.
magic eye gems to
My
Bosley.
lord, Bosley's
Medisha was the
smithing
first to
factory
voice
was
her
finally
doubts.
in operation.
I think I understand
the shops
what you
here
mean.
were part of Groton's
Using the
private
golden
property.
apple's power to restore Scarlet's life force.
This used to be AB's smithy.
She frowned,
but Bosley
this is like
bought the
drinking
houses on
poison
both
to quench
sides
one's
and expanded
thirst.
it. She used
However,
a phrase
having a
unique
place
to
to
the
silver
silver
elves
elves
to
everything was
express
going
the
well.
meaning of
Drinking
Bosley spent
poison
a lot
to
of
quench
effort
one's
to
thirst.
recruit people,
but at least
most of
Brando
them were of
understood.
mixed quality.
My lord,
Bosley
there is no other
complained
way.
to Brando
The
about
Shire
not
explained
supporting
his work
it's
more
better
than
to
once.
delay it for as long
he
as
came
possible.
from Erwin's palace
It's better
and
than
complained
facing
that
it
Brando
immediately.
didn't support his work.
Who knows, we might be able to
Fortunately,
find
the
some other way in
situation
the
changed
meantime.
after Uriel
The
brought
young
in the
magus
first batch
chuckled
of
as he looked
blacksmiths.
at Scarlet,
The
who was
blacksmiths
sitting
were
on the
sent
bed.
by Reto the Red Copper
He couldn't
Dragon.
help but tease her.
Considering
But
that
using the
Maxon
golden
might
apple
become
to
the
do
front
such
line
a
of the
thing will
war,
probably make
Reto
those
sent
who
almost
desire the
all of his
golden apple
capable
have
men
to
to
die from
Aves.
anger.
Of course, this was for the long term.
young wizard
but it
thought
was
for a
also
while
to
before
show
he
his
found the
loyalty
right
to the
word.
young lord.
It's a little overkill.
In any case, it solved
Scarlet
Bosley's
heard the
urgent
Shire's
problem.
words and lowered
Even
her
though
head
it was snowing
subconsciously.
heavily, the
When she
workshop was
regained her
bustling with
senses, she
activity.
felt that it was a
The
little
golden
wasteful.
red flames from
She
the
had the
furnaces
golden
dyed
apple
the
in her
entire
hands,
workshop
and it was
in
used on
orange
her.
red color. It was unbelievable.
The dazzling warm color
Scarlet
did not
felt
fit
that
in
she
with
had
the
never
cold
thought
white
of such a
color
thing
outside,
even in her wildest
forming a
dreams.
strong contrast.
But when the Shire
Even
saw
though
the
Brendo
girl's
was
reaction,
standing outside
he
the
realized
workshop,
that he
he could
misspoken.
feel the difference between
He
warmth
quickly
and
said,
cold because
Miss
of the color
Scarlet,
contrast.
don't think too much. My lord, I didn't mean to say
A voice
that it's
called
a
out
waste.
to him.
It's just that the
Bosley's
golden
attention
apple
was
is
diverted
priceless,
from
I
the
think.
numerous trivial
The
matters
young
in the
wizard
workshop
thought for a while
and he had
laughed.
to spend a lot
I
of
suddenly
effort to
remembered
instruct
what my
these
lord
foolish
said last
fellows.
time. Just as
It's a
he was
very
about to
apt
take a
description
breather,
of the current
he saw
situation.
Brendel and the other two
Everyone
standing
turned to
outside
look
the
at him.
workshop. Seal quickly
Grandmaster
shrugged.
Bosley.
All right,
Brando
I'm saying
smiled
that if
when
this
he saw
golden
him.
apple is a
He didn't
reward,
come
Miss
here to
Scarlet,
stroll
you'll
around and
probably
enjoy the
have to
snowy
marry
scenery
me in order
The
to pay
news
off
of
this
Lord
debt.
Paulus's army
The young
gathering had
wizard
caught his
squire
attention,
giggled.
and he had to
Marry
slowly
me?
carry out his plan.
Scarlet was stunned.
What is it?
That's what it means.
Bosley asked.
You know what I
My
mean.
lord, are you here to
The
check
Shire
on this
said
old
as he
man's
took a step
progress?
back, trying to
I
dodge
wouldn't dare.
Brando's sword. Brando shook his head.
But
As a wizard,
an idea.
it was obviously
An idea?
impossible for him to
Bosley
dodge
was
the
a
attack
little
of a
surprised,
swordsman of
but
the
when he
same
saw the
level
four
at such a
standing
close
in the
distance.
snow, he
As
quickly
soon
said,
as he finished his
"Anyway,
sentence,
please come
he
in."
screamed and
If
fell
my
to
lord
the
doesn't
ground,
mind the
clutching
noise
his
and
stomach.
filth in this place.
Brando was angry
Brando
at him
nodded
for
and
blurting
letting
out
out
such a
that
big
Scarlet,
mouth,
so
and
he
the young
didn't
man
hold
into
back.
the forge. He wanted the guy to lie
batch
on
of
the ground
armors
and
for a few
weapons were
minutes
being
before he
forged
could
in
get
the
up.
forge.
The
The
silver
young
elf
Lord
Medisha
Medisha
looked
looked
at the
the
Shire,
forge.
who was
There
rolling
were
on the
only
ground and
bare-chested
showed a
blacksmiths
you
and
deserve it
apprentices
look.
coming and going.
Scarlet
No
finally
one was
understood
wearing
the
a robe
Shire's
to instruct
words.
them. She
The
held the
Shire's
golden
people
apple
were not
and
here
lowered her
yet,
head, which
her
meant that
face read
Bosley's
all the
first
way to
batch
her
of
neck.
armors wasn't the
Brando
white
looked
lion
at her
armor.
and said, "Don't
You
pay
haven't
attention
started
to
on
what
the
this
magic
guy said.
armors yet? But if you really
My
want to
lord, you
repay
said
my
you weren't here
investment
to
in the
check
golden
on our
apple,
progress.
you have to live
Bosley
well."
couldn't help
Remember
but shake
what I
his head
said
and smile bitterly.
You are my most
It's been
important
too
fighter.
long since I last worked.
He took a deep
The
breath.
magic eye
I
gem you
think
gave me is
Tonijal will
precious.
soon face
I can't
a great
afford to
battle.
waste it.
Scarlet
I want
was
to
stunned
practice
and
first.
lowered her head. The
Not
old man
daring
looked
to
around
raise
the
it.
forge and
She
sighed.
just nodded.
Besides,
Brando
these people
wanted to
also
say
need to
something,
be
but he
skilled.
felt Medisha
They're still
tugging at
far
his
from being
sleeve.
skilled.
He turned
You're
around
the one
and
who's
saw the
asking too
silver elf
much.
princess frowning and asking, "What's the matter?"
Brando replied,
"My lord, if the golden apple can only solve the royal smithing bureau and was publicly acknowledged as the number one
The young
blacksmith."
man was stunned and
His
was about to
assistants
shake
were
his head
also
when he
well-known
heard
figures,
Orthless's
so
voice in
Brando
his
couldn't
mind.
help but look
"I have
down
an
on these
idea,
people.
little one.
The most
If you
skilled
want to know what
blacksmiths
will
among
happen
them
next,
were only from
please
the
go to
countryside.
www.
Not to mention that none of them had
GDN.
experience with
Com.
Arcanitech devices.
There are more chapters.
Some of them
Support
didn't
the
even have
author.
experience
Support
in
the
forging
original
weapons.
reading.
Forging armors was more complicated than forging weapons.
Chapter
Not only did it
342.
require experience from a
Orthless's method
blacksmith,
was simple,
but it also
since the
required
blood
the
of gods
skills of
was
a tailor
invading
and
and
leathersmith.
devouring the original
There
soul.
were blacksmiths
It was
for
in these
battle
professions
in
in
the
the
forge,
forge,
and they were
one of the
responsible
methods was
for
to
joining
destroy
the
the
parts
blood of
together to
gods.
create a
But
complete
since
set
that
of
was not
armor.
possible,
The
there
entire
was another way
process
to
was
think about
extremely
it.
slow. The knight's
Taking
suggestion
several
was to
hours
find
or
a way
even
to
an entire
strengthen
day to
Scarlet's
complete.
soul.
Bosley
When it came
frowned
to
as he looked at
strengthening
the
a
large
person's soul,
Arcanitech
there was
device
no
in the
one
middle
better
of the
than
forge.
wizards and
It
elementalists
was a
in
rather
this
primitive
aspect.
device that was
Orthless
almost
told
20 years
Brando
old.
that she had
It
thought
was
of this
used to
method
press the
because she
chest and
remembered
back plates
another
in one
special
go,
use of the
and then
golden
use
apple.
magic rays to
The
inscribe
golden
magic
apple was
arrays
also
on them.
known as the language
However,
of the
the working
fairies,
condition of
and
these
was the
dual
most
machines
precious
was
gift
quite
to wizards
unstable,
and
and they
elementalists.
often had problems.
However, it was not
Even the
easy to
machines
use
I
this
used 10
method
years
to
ago were
strengthen
better
one's
than
soul.
these two.
After
They're
all,
in worse
for a
condition
native
than
like
an old
Scarlet,
man like me.
leveling up was not
Bosley
something
felt
that could
that
be
he had
done
never
as long
done
as
such a
Brando
troublesome
gained
job in
experience.
his life.
It was a long and
Tanajul was
arduous
a remote
process,
and desolate
but
place,
for Scarlet,
and it was
even
hard
with the
for him
help
to
of the
imagine
golden
that
apple,
Erwin had
she
a
could
place
only
like this.
delay it for 1 or 2
Everything
years.
in this place seemed to be a
Orthless's
century
suggestion
behind the
was to
times
let
he knew.
Scarlet and the blood
Without
of God fight
Arcanitech
for the
devices,
power of the golden
the inside
apple.
of the city
But
was
this
like
was
a
also
huge
very
garbage dump.
difficult.
First
Outside
of all,
the city
the
was
speed
the
of
wilderness,
absorption was different.
and agriculture was
Unless
still
Scarlet
at the most
reached the
primitive
level of
stage
an
of
elemental
self-cultivation,
awakener or an
in the era
elementalist
that
within 2
Bosley was
years.
familiar with,
This suggestion
which was almost
was not
10
very
years ago,
realistic.
in the most
But to
prosperous
reach the
areas
level of an
Erwin,
elementalist
magic
within
was
2
used to
years.
nurture crops.
Brando thought
There were
about it
even
and shook
students
his head.
from the academy
But no
stationed
matter
in
what,
the fields.
it was better to
Those
have a way than to have
elementalist
no way.
apprentices could change
Although
the
it was
arrangement
difficult
of the
to promote
elements
a
in a
person
small
to the
area
level
to
of an
make the weather more
elementalist,
suitable
it was
for
not
growing
impossible.
crops.
But there was nothing
Brando
like that
knew
here.
that there were some
In
harsh
other
methods
regions,
to achieve it.
large
But
Arcanitech
now he could only
devices were
try his
already
best.
used in agriculture.
Of course, he did not
Although
tell
this was
anyone
only a
about
part
this
of the
and buried
revolution
it in
that
his
happened
heart.
in the last 100
In the
years.
end, Brando
The
gently
Kurlutz
closed the
people
door.
learned this technology
Medisha,
from the Hazel
Valerne,
people, and the Shire
indirectly
followed him out
influenced
of the
Dalein's
house.
development.
Although
This
Scarlet had
technology
temporarily
even changed
recovered,
the November
her body
War
was
and
brought
still
about
very
the Second
weak.
Holy War.
It was not suitable
However,
for her
the
to be
rapid
disturbed
advancement
too
of
much.
Arcanitech
Brando
technology
only
still
arranged
changed
for
the world.
Amandina to
Of
accompany
course,
her.
Except
Of course,
for
he did
Tanajul.
not wake up the
It wasn't
Roman
just
who was
sleeping
sleeping.
soundly.
In Bosley's
It was
view,
not that he
the
did not
entire
want
Randa
to,
region
but it
was
was
a barren
Amandina's
land
that was
idea.
abandoned by history.
Then let her sleep a
It
little
was as
longer,
if it had a master
Brando
who
thought.
didn't like magic,
In fact, he
and
also
it was
felt a little
excluded from
sorry for the little
civilization.
Roman.
Of course,
Back in
this was only
Schaffland,
Bosley's
the self-proclaimed
merchant
prejudice.
girl's workload was even heavier than his.
Brando
And after
knew that the
returning here,
poverty in
she
the south
accompanied
of
Scarlet
Erwin
was
for a
due
day
to many
and a night.
reasons.
Brando
It wasn't
rubbed
just
his
Randa,
throbbing
but also
temples.
grimoires
Even
and
though it
Karsu.
was temporary,
The
the
southern
golden
border
apple
of the
had
kingdom
finally
had
solved
always
one of
been
his
at the edge
worries.
of civilization.
He just didn't know what
Due
kind
to
of
the difference in
seasoning
development,
the little
the
female
difference in
dragon had
geography,
added to the
and
apple,
the invasion of
so he
monsters,
couldn't tell for the
there were
time
many
being.
factors. My lord,
Whether it was
the
Butchie,
Shire
Braggs,
called
or
from
Tanajul,
Tanajul. These
the
places were
young
like
squire
two
still
different
had one
worlds
hand on
compared
his
to the
abdomen
hinterland
and was
of the
bending
kingdom.
over with a grimace.
Just bear with
but
it,
his
Grandmaster
face was now a little
Bosley.
more serious.
Brando shook his head. Even though
Brando
the two
glanced at him,
Arcanitech
then
devices
turned
were a
around
pile
and
of
walked
scrap
forward.
metal in Erwin, they were
he
treasures
replied.
here. The number
When
of people
Amandina
coming
found
from
them
the
and brought
palace
his
has
warehouse,
clearly increased.
she wanted to dismantle
Where?
one of them to
These?
study the magic
Brando
channeling
asked.
device inside.
No, this is
but
the
she was
information
stopped by
from
the
the Red
Bosley.
Copper Dragon
It
and
seemed
the
that her
others.
decision back
Menta?
then was wise.
The Shire nodded.
At least the two Arcanitech devices
Brando was
were
a
of
little
great help to
surprised.
him.
This
No
was
matter
the
how
first time
old
he
these
had
two old
received
machines
news from the
were,
Red Copper
at least they
Dragon
were better
and the
than
others
Tanajul's
after so
primitive
many
handicrafts.
days. Although the
Brando
young man
couldn't
had
imagine
arranged
how
for the
long it
Amber
would take to
Sword
realize
to
his
take
plan
advantage
with the
of the
productivity
situation
of
and
babies,
attack Menta's
which was
old
still
lair.
stuck in the
Even
Middle
he
Ages on
himself
Earth.
wasn't sure if the
Time
Red
waits
Copper
for no
Dragon
one.
and the others would
P.S.
actually listen
Everyone's
to him.
enthusiasm
Once
has
a person
cooled down,
had power,
please
they would
support
become
me.
arrogant.
To be continued Perhaps
if
Redo
you want to know
wouldn't,
what will happen
but it was
next,
hard to say
please
for the
go to
people around him.
www.
He slowly
GDN.
revealed an interested
There are more
expression and
chapters.
asked the
Support
Shire
the
to
author.
report the
Support the
information
original
from the other
reading.
side. From the young magus, the young man learned the whole story. After Menta sent out his troops,
Chapter
the person in
349.
charge of the castle was his
Bosley
eldest
nodded at
son.
Brando's words.
In order to prevent
Then,
his
my
son
lord,
from
what
killing
did you
his
say
other
you had
brothers
in
while he
mind?
was away,
Bosley
Menta
took out a
didn't
pipe
leave
from
many
his
troops
pocket,
in the castle.
but he looked at Brando
However,
and
this
remembered
created
that he
a
didn't
perfect
like the smell of
opportunity for
tobacco.
Redo and the others.
He hesitated
They
for a
took
moment
advantage
before
of the
putting
night
it
to
back.
launch a sneak attack.
How's that thing going?
As for the enemies,
Brando
they
didn't
didn't
answer
expect them to be
Bosley's
so
question.
daring and ended up as
Bosley was
captives.
startled for a moment,
After
but he
taking control of
quickly
the
reacted,
castle, the Red
"My
Copper
lord, are you
Dragon did
talking
the same
about that
thing as
thing?"
Brando. We've already made more than 200 sets. As a puppet, and the workshop has been fully operational recently. Manor owners, but we still don't have enough even the monks of the Menta area. If we can expand the workshop to more than 100 people during the so-called bank requirements. After that, 200 sets. Immediately ordered his men to spread out that it was slightly lower than his requirements. Leading the refugees from Fortress Reedon to eliminate a few bandit groups. It was impossible to find enough skilled workers to expand the workshop to more than 100 people. The whole process wasn't as smooth as it was described. Even if there were enough blacksmiths, there wouldn't be enough magic tools. Brando didn't even consider the captain of the White Main Army, Terran, played a decisive role. He shook his head. If it wasn't for Bosley, the refugees from Fortress Reedon would have been nothing more than a bunch of refugees. Support such a large workshop. Much to Brando's surprise, even if we add in Maxon, we don't have iron or coal. There were some differences for a moment before shaking his head. It would be great if we could make an elemental furnace. Terran was a silent and obedient soldier. Brando didn't find it strange that he had to deal with all kinds of furnaces in his following him in brags. Even if he hadn't also understand from Brando, he could guess why would this captain from Fortress Reedon side with him? An elemental furnace could directly absorb the elemental fire in the air. Of course, as mentioned before, Brando had a good habit. It was a major innovation. If he couldn't figure it out, he would temporarily stop thinking about it to avoid a headache. Elemental furnace was only invented about 20 years later, and the inventor was Erwin. Brando wasn't he couldn't remember that person's name for the time being. He approved of the other party's actions. This was because in the next 2 decades, due to the skyrocketing of the mana tide, that the Amber Sword mercenary group would be able to take over Lord Maxon's inventions based on mana channeling devices. But he didn't expect Copper Dragon to give him such a surprise. To remember all of them. From the information he received, these things didn't have much to do with players, and Brando was half of Maxon's territory. Although this meant that Lord Maxon's governance wasn't good enough, she was an expert in this field. Beyond his however, he shook his head and discarded this unrealistic fantasy. Maxon, Shaflin, instead, he tried to remember that the guy who invented the fire element furnace was an elementalist. If they could control Maxon, in a noble family, it would be equivalent to controlling whether he was in Iraq or a Vero. Roland could not remember. Brando asked again. As he thought about it, from the mercenary group, a brief explanation of the Shire nodded. The old man's eyes lit up when he heard that. The young squire once again showed a playful expression and smiled. Is there really such a thing that doesn't use coal? Why don't you take a guess, some other kind of fuel? Yes. Bosley's face was tilted his head 45 degrees. He could almost imagine how significant this corner of his eyes. Just from the economic aspect alone, right it would save them an immeasurable amount of money. Already on Howran Gaia's hilt and cried out in fear. Not to mention, no, my lord, the flame created by the fire element was not an oxidation reaction in the ordinary sense. Brando brought the significance of using this method to remove the impurities in the metal was comparable to obtaining a divine weapon for an old Fortress Reedon's cavalry. Yes, I read about it in an ancient document. He originally hesitated for a moment before because that boorish mercenary group leader had been with him for the longest time and understood him the most. The technology of the Buga wizards. Gasol was also startled when he saw Brando. Used magical forging. He hadn't seen Brando for almost half a year when she heard Brando's words. And now this young man, her tone was still as gentle as ever. The wild elf girl out from the shadows of the hall. Or did something change in the modern era? Were completely different from the young man he saw in Fortress Reedon. He immediately realized that he had misspoken. Gasol didn't dare to go up did not exist, so he could stubble as much as he wanted. Trekking in the wilderness, she was also a silver blood and elf and knew the history of the Buga craftsman. The shyness and childishness he thought for a moment and finally found an excuse. This young lord slightly pursed his lips, which symbolized the resoluteness and determination in his heart. His eyes were sharp, but I think there's a possibility. A person's heart. It seems to be the Myana's way of doing things. The young man was wearing a black robe. She looked at Brando with her bright silver eyes, but it didn't reduce his temperament at all. Forging was lost before the war of the Holy as an unsheathed sword. I think the document you saw was a description of the technology of the Buga wizards against their enemies. That casual glance Brando was sweating profusely when he heard this explanation. He had only seen such an aura. He was glad that Medisha took the initiative to cover up this big lie. This was an aura that came from the battlefield. He had to admit that it was Martha's blessing. Lord. He prayed in his heart and nodded. The security cavalry hesitated for a moment. At this moment, left his seat Bosley and stood up subconsciously from his daydream. At that moment, he was secretly surprised. Sir, not only did Brando's aura change, but there was also an even more minute detail that made his heart skip a beat and looked at the old man. Was very clear about Brando's original strength. It's not difficult to draw it. The strongest he could be was no higher than a silver. Bosley immediately jumped up in excitement. Even though the strength of an iron rank was commendable for such a young man, was too great. It was still acceptable. He patted his chest excitedly. But now the young man standing in front of Gasol gave him an even bigger shock. He could no longer sense his opponent's strength. No one in Aween can compare to me in the art of forging. It was bottomless. Why don't you tell me about it? Originally only an iron rank. Really but after half a year of adventuring, whether it was his swordsmanship or absolute Grandmaster Bosley, he had made great progress. The structure of this furnace is simple, but there are a few difficulties. Of iron rank. First, it needs a mana core and a mana of silver. Second, his improvement needs a method to collect the elemental among everyone, second only to Terran. Third, originally he wasn't a match for the elemental, but now he can fight him to his flame. But even
the first
so,
difficulty
he found that he could
requires
no
the
longer
use of
see
magic.
through Brando's
The second
strength.
is the use of
The young man's
elementalists,
hand was
and
placed
the
on the
third
hilt of his
requires
sword,
alchemy.
and his
As
aura
for the
naturally
structure of
formed
the
a
furnace,
whole.
I believe you
This
can
was
easily
the sign
solve
of
it.
great swordsmanship.
Brando shook
Master
his head.
rank.
But what about
the former
other
captain
problems?
of the security
Can you
cavalry
solve them?
couldn't believe his eyes.
Bosley was speechless.
He thought that his improvement was fast enough, but he didn't think that Brando's
collecting
improvement
the
was
elemental
even faster than
particles in
his,
the air,
and even
Medisha
exceeded
spoke
his
up.
imagination.
It's actually not
In just
that
half
difficult.
a year, the young man had surpassed
Little
him by
girl,
2
you
ranks
know
or even
about it?
more.
Bosley
Even a
jumped
genius
up and
wouldn't
asked
be able
loudly.
to do this. His
The
loud
Saul
voice
was
attracted
dumbfounded.
the attention of the
Above
craftsmen
2
and
ranks,
apprentices
wasn't
around
that the
him.
strength of an
The old
intermediate
man's face
silver
reddened,
rank?
but he
He
couldn't
couldn't
hold back
imagine
his
this feat.
excitement and asked
Brando
again,
nodded at
"Then
him.
tell me, little
I
girl.
didn't think it would be
This
you who
thing is
came,"
very important
the young
to
man
us,"
said frankly.
Brando shook his
You've
head.
worked hard.
He didn't think that
My
this
lord,
thing was that important.
Gasol
It
sincerely
was just
lowered
a
his head
furnace.
this time.
Although it solved
Brando
the
had led
problem
them
of
out
fuel
of
shortage,
Fortress Reedon,
and perhaps
and
it
at
would
that
improve
time he had
Shaflan's
established his
smelting
prestige
process.
in everyone's hearts.
Tonagel didn't produce
Everyone
any
remembered
iron.
the high-spirited
This was another
figure who led
bottleneck
them to
that could
charge
be a
into
death
the
sentence
undead
for
army.
Bosley's expansion
But as time
plan.
passed,
In his
his
plan,
started to
the
forget
expansion
the
of
initial
AB's
gratitude.
factory would have to
When
wait until
Brando
his
asked
trip
them
to
to attack
Amberlight was
Maxon's
over.
territory,
My
this
lord,
order
don't
caused a
underestimate
huge
this
uproar
thing.
in the mercenary
Can
group.
save you a lot of money.
Many people disagreed
With this money, you
order.
can buy more iron
Attacking
ores
a
and I can
legitimate
create
noble
more
was a
weapons
bit
and armor
outrageous
for
and
you.
audacious.
You can also
But it
gather
was
more
him,
troops.
Taran, and
Bosley
Badim who stood up to
reprimanded
support
Brando
this
sternly.
order. He
My
didn't know
lord,
what
don't
Taran and
underestimate
Badim were
this
thinking,
thing.
but he
Can
had his
save
own
you a lot of
ideas.
money.
With this money, you can buy
Katos
more
was
iron
once the
ores, and I
captain
can
of the
create more
security
weapons and
cavalry
armor
in
for
Fortress
Reedon. He paused
With
for
the
a
support
moment
of the
before
nobles
continuing.
behind him,
He could do whatever he wanted in
the
that small
princess?
place. Without
Other
an
than the
army,
White
you can't
Mane
even
army
protect
and the
yourself.
nobles,
How
everyone
can you
had to
respectfully
respectfully
call him Captain Gasol?
The situation in the
But
north
Gaspard
is getting
was no
worse
fool.
by the day.
He knew that
I don't
behind
think the
this
princess
respect
can
was
wait
fear
for the
and
day
even
my
hatred.
lord grows his
But
wings.
at that time he didn't
Brando
care.
felt a headache
In his
coming
eyes,
on when
the
he
world
heard the
was one-sided
grandmaster
and
blacksmith
one-sided,
nagging,
and he
only
quickly
those with
nodded in
power and
agreement.
authority could
But
rise
when he
above
heard
others.
Bosley mention money, he suddenly had
Until
an idea
Brando
and
led them
changed
to
his
defeat
mind.
the dark undead
Bosley
of
saw the
Madara,
significance
who were
of
much
the
stronger
elemental
than the
furnace,
nobles
and
in
so did
Fortress
the others.
Reedon,
And
not
even
to
made
mention
them
how
tremble in
important
fear.
it was to the
Only then did
blacksmithing
he
and
realize
smelting
that there was a
industry.
power in
Even
this
if it
world
was
that could make people's
miniaturized and
blood
sold
boil.
to the nobles,
It was a
it would
power
still
that
be a
could make
profitable
people devote
business.
themselves
Brando
wholeheartedly
had
to it.
decades of experience,
Young people call
and
it an
naturally
ideal.
knew that this was a
Redo
profitable
told him
business.
that it was faith. He was
If you
still
want to know
worried
what
about
will
what
happen
goods
next,
to bring to
please go to
Amberseal, but now it seemed that a bright future lay in front of him. Come and read more
Thinking
chapters.
of this, he quickly
Support
nodded
the author,
and interrupted
support the
Bosley's
original
words,
reading,
saying to Medisha,
Translator,
"Why don't you
endless
explain it to
fantasy
the master
translation
Medisha?"
editor. Medisha
Endless
smiled
fantasy
and answered
translation
quietly,
editor.
It's actually
Endless
very
fantasy
simple.
translation.
You just need to use a magic array. Magic array? Chapter
Brando
343. But the
The will
release
to
of
live.
fire
When
elemental
he decided
energy
to join
requires
the
a
Amber
magic
Sword,
array.
he hesitated,
The
but in
absorption
the end
and
he
release
made his
magic
decision.
arrays can't be
In
stacked
fact,
together.
when he was adventuring
Also,
with
the
the Red
absorption
Copper
magic
Dragon,
array can't
the leader
withstand
of the
harsh
cavalry
conditions.
was also hesitant.
Unlike the release
He had
magic
to
array,
lead
which
so
can
many
withstand high
refugees through
temperatures.
several areas,
If you
and
use a
sometimes even had
reinforcement
to fight
magic
with
array,
bandits on the
I'm
main
afraid
road.
the absorption
Life
effect
was
will
much
be
more
difficult than when he was in Fortress Reedon.
Although
He did not
Brando
know why
only
he did
had
it.
a few levels
All
of
he
alchemy,
knew was that
he
the
still
people
had
he
the
knew in the
knowledge from the
past,
game,
the refugees
and this
from
basic
Fortress
knowledge
Reedon,
was not
the people
difficult
who
for him.
hated him in the past,
Let's separate
now
them.
spoke to him with a
If
kind
we
of respect.
separate them, what about
the way
the
they addressed
conduction
him
of
did not
elemental
change.
energy?
It was still the same
Brando
captain.
knew that the conduction
But
of
some things
magic
were
was
different.
no longer a problem.
Uriel
in
found
Wong,
that he could no
but the
longer
conduction
abandon
of
elemental
everything he
energy
had
was
now,
another problem.
or rather, return
At
to
least
the days
until
of the
now,
past.
he had not heard
It
of
was as
anyone
if something
who could called a
called
sense of
elemental
responsibility
energy
had been
unless
born
it
in
was
his
done
heart.
by an elementalist.
This was the reason why
But if
he
an
supported
elemental
Brando.
furnace needed an
It was very
elementalist
simple.
to be on duty
Captain
24
Ulliel
hours a
told
day,
himself that he
then
did
it
not
would need at
support
least
this
6
young
to
lord,
7 elementalists.
but the person who changed
This
him.
investment was a
He
bit of a
felt that
loss
if
that
a
was
person
not
with
worth
such
it.
charisma could
My
change
lord,
and
you
influence
forgot
a
that I'm a
person like
silver
him,
elf.
then he must have the
Medisha
ability
whispered.
to lead them to the
Brando
end.
was stunned.
That was
What
why
did
he
this
did
have
not
to do with
hesitate to
silver
stand
elves?
on the side of Badim
Little
and
one.
Taran. But at this
Uriel
time, he
lowered
suddenly
his
heard
head.
Orthlus's
Many
voice
thoughts
in his
running
mind.
through his mind at
I've
that always wanted to ask, but what really troubled him was Brando's strange order. If you want to know what will happen next, and finally please go to www with a bitter smile.
Chidian,
my lord, there are more chapters. Brando did not think any less than Uriel, the original but the young man thought further. He walked past Uriel and turned around. What is it?
Chapter 350.
My lord, Uriel replied helplessly. His voice
you said that you would
inherit a piece of land.
I've always wanted
to ask,
you did not tell us that you would inherit it like
you a royal elf. Although the former
Lady
captain of the
Orthlis
cavalry
Medicis
stood on
royal.
Brando's side,
What's wrong?
he did not completely
Brando
approve
replied,
of Brando's actions.
It's nothing.
He was
She looks
familiar with the
familiar
rules
just
of
like
the
someone
nobles'
I know,
game, and
but I
naturally
don't think
knew
it's
that
possible.
Brando's actions were
She's
against the
probably
world.
her descendant.
Brando was
Orthlis
taken
shook her
aback.
head.
He
But
hadn't
if she's a
expected
royal,
Gasper
then
to
your
be
question
thinking
won't
about
be a
this.
problem.
This question made the corner
One
of
of the
his mouth
silver
twitch.
elves' silver
He
legacies
couldn't
is the
possibly say
elemental
that this was an
conduction
impromptu
technique.
idea.
Royal
Could he?
elves must have mastered this
Fortunately,
technique.
Amandina wasn't here,
Orthlis replied,
or else he
then
would have
fell
been
silent.
embarrassed by the
So
resentful
that's
gaze
why.
of the noble lady
Brando
who had
looked
been
at Medici
complaining about his
curiously.
decision.
Do you know how
the
to
young
do
man
it, Medici?
smiled awkwardly.
The silver elf
Originally,
girl nodded
I was
gently.
going to inherit the
All right,
territory,
this problem is
but there
solved.
was an unexpected
Brando
situation.
knew that this was actually
Groton
one of the
has
two
caused
most
me a lot of
difficult
trouble,
problems
but it's
of the
not a big
elemental
deal.
furnace.
We'll get
Solving
what
this
belongs
problem
to us
could
in
be
the
said
end.
to have solved half
Brando
of the
started
problem,
to
or
change
even
the
more than
topic.
half of it,
But
but
he
he
still
still
asked,
Randner.
Then how do
I
I
don't think
convert
he'll
these
let this
fire
matter
elements
rest.
into continuous flames?
Gaspard glanced at
As
the
far
young
as I
lord
know,
and asked
most of the
worriedly.
alchemy arrays are
That's why I
instantaneous,
wanted to see you before.
but the elemental furnace
Brando
needs to be
replied.
stable and
Did Uncle
continuous.
Redo ask you to bring the
Is there
news
no
over,
way to solve it?
Gaspard?
The
Bosley's
words
raised
Uncle
eyebrows
Redo
sank
made
again.
Gaspard heave
It
a
doesn't
sigh of
seem that
relief.
difficult, he said with a troubled
All
expression.
signs showed that
Of
Brando
course
was a
it's
sentimental
difficult.
person.
The stability
In
of
fact,
the array is very
Brando
high,
did not send
but
any
it's
of his
not like
trusted
there's no
subordinates
alternative.
to mend the castle
One
for
is
the
to
past
strengthen
half a
the
month.
array, but this will
Instead,
affect the
he
output.
allowed the copper
The
dragon
other is
Redo
to
to
use
take
better
charge of the
materials,
castle,
which will increase the
This
cost.
showed that Brando had full
Brando
trust
thought
in
for a
them.
while.
Of course,
Elemental
this was a
furnace
slight
could be strengthened by the Brando's intentions,
but the cost of the
Brando
elemental
did not
furnace
think
would be
about this at
slightly
all.
higher.
Shaflin
After
was
all,
so
the
busy
wool
that
comes
he
from
didn't
the
even
sheep.
think about what
Even though
Redo
it was
and the others
difficult,
would do.
he remembered that he had
Occupying
tamar with him.
Tonajol was a
It
chess
shouldn't
piece
be
to
a problem
prepare
to
for the
give it to
future
a war.
master alchemist.
In fact, Brando did
He
not
shook
think
his
much
head and
about
threw
it.
the question aside.
The nobles in
All right,
Tonajol were
it's
so
better than
poor that
nothing.
they were just short
Let's
of pawning
move on
their
to the
pants.
next question.
Brando did
What
not
about
even
the mana
bother to think
conduction
about
device
taking
in the
over these
core?
places.
I
But he
can
did
think
not
of a way
plan
to
to
do
do
anything
anything about it.
Bosley glanced
Instead,
at him, and
he
for
allowed
the
the
first
copper
time the
dragon
old man
to
enjoy the thrill
I
of
have
being a
contacts in
lord,
Amber's
and those who
who
originally
originally
doubted his
decipher.
decision
I can
gradually
probably
calmed
ask
down.
them to help me get
Of course,
some,
but
there
I
were
can't
still
hope
some
for the
voices
largest
that were
ones.
worried about Count Randner's
Medium
revenge.
is enough.
But to
Brando
these
replied,
fugitives, it
as
did
for
not
the
matter
mana
whether
conduction
Count Randner
device,
retaliated or
Amandina
not.
had a set of
At
primitive
worst, they could
designs
just
that could
hide in
barely
the
be
forest.
used. Yes,
That thing
my
was
lord.
even rarer than
Gaspard
the mana
nodded,
core,
and it was
Brando
almost
bent his
completely
finger and
controlled
knocked
by
on
the
the
royal
long
family
table.
and nobles.
His brows
Nevertheless,
were tightly knitted together.
Yang Ming glanced
My
at the
lord.
blacksmith master
Gaspard
in
was
surprise.
surprised.
This was
It's
the
earlier
first
than
time
I
the
thought.
blacksmith master
The war
took
has
the
come.
initiative to use his social
Brando
network.
replied.
It seemed
What?
that this thing was
The
very
historical
attractive to
Lord
the old
Paulus
man.
is a wise and
However,
prudent
what
man.
surprised
He
Brando
will
the
not
most
be
was that
unaware of the
nobles,
news of
especially
his
someone
comrade's
like Bosley,
defeat.
had a
This
huge
is enough
network
to
of
make him
connections.
slow down his
If he
plans
could
and
make
become
use of
more
this network,
cautious.
it would be great
The
news.
historical Lord Paulus.
The Copper Knight
couldn't help
repeated
but
with a
ask,
serious expression.
"If that's the case, why
Brando
don't you ask
glared at
them to
him,
help
and
us
the
get
young
some
wizard
people?
quickly shrank
Aren't
back.
you lacking manpower,
He was already
Grandmaster
used to his
Bosley?
lord's strange way of
Bosley
speaking.
glared at him.
But
Do
this
you want
knight
to
did
drag
not
more
withdraw
people
his
down
hands
with
and
you?
feet. I don't
Instead,
care about
his
the others,
movements
but
became
don't even
more
think
frequent.
about it. This
The
means
people
that
I
he has
know are
received
either
from
from
the
the
royal
Randner's
faction or
orders.
my students.
This is a sign
I
of
don't want
war.
them to be on the
The
pirate
former
ship.
captain of the Knights gasped
No,
in surprise.
you're mistaken.
A sign of war?
Brando did not give
He
up
knew
and
that
continued
Count
to
Randner
persuade
would
the old
definitely
man,
seek revenge,
whether it's the royal
but he did
faction
not
or us,
expect it
we're
to
all
come
in the
so
same
quickly.
boat. He was
We're all
not even
working for
mentally
the
prepared
princess,
for
aren't
it.
we? My
Bosley
lord?
snorted. The silver elf
Even though he
princess
did not
asked
believe
softly from
Yang Ming's
behind,
words,
he remembered
shook
that
his
Brando
head,
resonated
indicating
with the
that there was no
Lionheart sword
need
and was
to
a
be
little
too worried.
convinced. But
What
I've
should we
already
do?
agreed to work
Gaspard
for you,
was
young
a little
man.
worried.
As for
The
my
highest
students,
level of
I have
nobles he
no
had
right
come
to
to
interfere
contact
with
with
their
their
decisions.
decisions.
Were the gentry
As
and
for the
Fortress
royal
Reading's
faction,
local
there's
council,
no need to talk
he could
about
only
it.
look up to those who were
I'm
of a
not
higher
asking
level.
you to interfere
Count
with their
Randner's
decisions,
status was
Grandmaster
not
Bosley.
inferior to the Duke
Brando
of
shook his head
Grimoires.
and sighed.
Gaspard
I'm not
could not
forcing them
imagine
to
that
work
he
for
would
me.
be able to crush
They
him
can
like
also
an ant.
help us out a little.
He could not help
People
but look
need
at
to learn
Brando
to be
in surprise.
flexible.
Why was the
You
young
see,
man
this isn't
talking
much
about
different
something
from
that had
helping us
nothing to
smuggle
do with
goods.
him?
In
It was
essence,
as if he
they're
did
working
not
for the
offend
princess,
powerful
and they're
count,
also working
but a
for
country
Erewin's
bumpkin.
lost glory.
Are you afraid?
Most importantly,
Brando
we'll pay
asked.
for it.
Not at
We
all.
won't let your students
Gaspard
suffer
quickly
any
shook his
losses,
head.
Grandmaster Bosley.
This is a win-win situation. Brendel drew out a beautiful picture for Bosley as he patiently guided him along. Of course, Scarlet and Medisha could not help but laugh when they saw this. This young lord was like a demon from the scorching hell, a hypocrite with a wicked heart. They looked at Bosley, who was stunned by Brando's words, and then at Brando. The young lord quietly turned around and glared at them to prevent them from laughing and ruining the atmosphere. Brando could not help but think to himself. He had only been a leader in the game for a few years, and yet he had already mastered the art of painting a beautiful picture of himself. However, compared to the managers of large and small enterprises in his previous world, he was still a child in the presence of an adult. If those people were to transmigrate to this world, they would be able to establish a large-scale international fraud organization. No, it should be a large-scale international corporation. No, it should be a large-scale international religious organization. And it would not be inferior to the Holy Cathedral of Wind or the Holy Cathedral of
full of fire. Brando promised Bosley while his mind was still spinning with these random thoughts. Bosley, the royal craftsman of Erewhon, seemed to have been persuaded. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Very well, my lord. What else do you need?" "People." Brando said. "More people." "People." Bosley was shocked. He stared at Brando in shock. "Why you want me to do human trafficking? Are you crazy?" Erewhon forbids human trafficking. Bosley's words were lacking in confidence. There were many underground black markets in Erewhon, and the nobles were doing the same. It was an open secret. However, this young lord was not such a person. Bosley had always been dismissive of Brando's idealistic integrity,
but as a young man and not a lord, he admired his character. Brando furrowed his brows and shook his head. What are you talking about? What human trafficking? That's too filthy. Mr. Bosley, don't bring the bad habits of the old nobles to my domain. Bosley did not choke on his words. He stared at Brando in annoyance. Didn't you bring this up first? You said you want people, but it seems that there is no other way to get more people other than buying and selling people. Then what do you mean, my lord? Bosley asked in annoyance. Brando nodded. Very well. Do you know about the War of the Black Roses? What's that? That's... Brendel suddenly paused because he remembered that the officials had yet to give this war a unified name. As for the War of the Black Roses, there was no such thing. He coughed and changed his words. I'm talking about the war that just ended. You're talking about the invasion of Madara? Bosley asked in confusion. But what does that have to do with the War of the Black Roses? Bosley's face turned red, but he could not help but frown. Can't this old man stop poking at my sore spot? But just as he was thinking of a way to get out of this awkward situation, Scarlet whispered, I heard that Madara is known as the Black Rose of Bramanto. I believe that's what my lord is talking about. Bosley nodded in understanding. That makes sense. I believe that the chronicler would have named it that way. So what's next? Brando wanted to hug Scarlet and give her a kiss, if not for the fact that he did not want to let down the little Roman. But he gave up on the thought and coughed softly before continuing. The War of the Black Roses may seem like the biggest war Erwin has experienced since the November War, but that's not the case. Ever since the royal family lost control of the region, the nobles have been waging war against each other year after year. This ancient kingdom has been in deep trouble for a long time. Brando was telling the truth about Erwin for the past 20 years. Everyone present nodded in agreement. Grandmaster Bosley, do you know about the refugees in Menta? Bosley asked. Of course, some of my subordinates came from that group of refugees. Bosley paused for a moment before he suddenly realized what Brando meant. My lord, you mean, refugees? Brendel nodded. The years of war had created a large number of homeless refugees. These refugees either relied on powerful lords to become tenant farmers or citizens without personal freedom, or had no food or clothing and no fixed place to stay. Even though he did not have a detailed count, he believed that in this era of Erwin, be it in the north or the south, there would be a large number of people who were troubled by such hardships. It was easy to attract these people. A full meal and a yearning for a better life would be enough to attract them to Tanajal. What he wanted to provide was nothing more than a way for them to reach this place. Bosley quickly calmed down after his initial shock and reminded, My lord, these refugees may be real, but most of them are old, sick, or disabled. There are also women and children. A strong and healthy laborer is valuable in anyone's eyes. I'm afraid that such a good thing won't happen to you, my lord. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 351. Brendel nodded. Of course he had considered such a situation, but it was not like there were no strong and healthy people among the old, weak, sick, and disabled. Some young people would stay with their families, but most lords would not take in a family for a single worker. This was where Brendel's advantage lay. Women could do many things and children were the future of the fief. Not many people in this era had such foresight, but Brando had to consider Erwin's future. He waved his hand and interrupted Grandmaster Blacksmith. Grandmaster Bosley, I've considered all of this and it shouldn't be a problem. Population is the future of a fief, and the ignorant nobles can't see that. But I don't mind teaching them a lesson. In any case, I'll leave this matter to you. Now that we have people, what about food? Bosley was still worried. Even though he did not want to, he had to admit that Brando's methods were deeply rooted in the hearts of the people. Whether it was out of selfishness or righteousness, he did not want to see the young man's efforts go to waste. Even in the dead of night, Bosley had wondered more than once if this young man was really the one who was born to fulfill his orders. Otherwise, why would he resonate with the Lionheart sword? And what he did was supported by everyone. That kind of scene sometimes really made him feel like he was looking at that person. That person who swore an oath under a glorious banner. Bosley could not believe it. Food is a problem, Brando nodded, but then he looked at Bosley strangely. Grandmaster Bosley, when did you start to care about this? Bosley's face reddened. I'm just asking. I understand, Brendel gave a mysterious smile. Food is indeed a huge problem, but seeing so many refugees displaced from their homes,
This one's heart is pained and I cannot eat or sleep in peace. So no matter how difficult it is, I must persevere. Isn't that right, Grandmaster Bosley? You. Bosley saw that Brando's words were full of righteousness, but his eyes were smiling like a little fox. He could not help but get angry. Cut the crap, you bastard. What's going on? Medisha couldn't help but cover her mouth. Of course it's not that serious. Brando shrugged. Food is a problem, but with the support of Shaflun's silver mines, it won't be a problem for the time being. Just buying won't do. Aren't you afraid that the dukes in the north will block you? The old man shook his head and said worriedly. Firstly, the merchants of Ampere Seal are all merchants. Brando raised another finger. Secondly, the northern fleet is still in the hands of Her Royal Highness. Of course, Grandmaster Bosley's words are also a concern. However, Tonajal isn't inherently barren. Brando thought to himself. Since he had a druid under his command, why would he be afraid of problems with farming? These turf players were much better than elementalists when it came to agriculture. Although convincing the druids who believed in the balance of nature might be a little troublesome, Brando had already set up a trap for them to jump into. They had signed such a treaty before, allowing the druids to participate in all wars to defend this territory. The food war is also a war. Brendel snickered. The old man looked at him and shook his head. I don't know why you need so many people. Tonajal already has a large population. As long as you can occupy this place, it won't be difficult to build an army. Brando did not reply. Bosley did not understand his dream. His dream was not just Tonajal, nor was it Valhalla, nor was it Erewhon. The young man's goal was the future. His journey was the endless wilderness. After the glory of the ancients, humans would once again pick up the lost flag and march into the wilderness. Erewhon would expand and become a powerful empire. And the opportunity was in the wilderness where civilization could not reach. Brando did not answer Bosley's question, but he knew that one day, these people would understand why he was doing this. He smiled and changed the topic. Grandmaster Bosley, since when did you care so much about this humble one's territory? Are you sincerely planning to join this humble one's side? The master craftsman choked and coughed loudly. After a while, he managed to catch his breath and replied in exasperation, Brat, what are you thinking? I'm just worried that you'll lose everything and drag down my career. No, I mean hinder Her Royal Highness from reviving the kingdom. If that's the case, then aren't you going too far from the topic? Brando asked in amusement. What do you mean? Weren't we talking about a plan? How did we end up talking about food? Or do you want to change jobs with Miss Amandina, Grandmaster Bosley? Bosley naturally knew that Brendel was mocking him. Even though this young lord's character was outstanding compared to the other nobles of this generation, it was obvious that he was lacking in respect for the elderly, and he did not repent even in death. He replied snappily, I'm not as shameless as you, my lord, to snatch a little girl's rice bowl. We were talking about the elemental furnace. Forget it, I'll give up on explaining it. Bosley suddenly realized that it would be disadvantageous for him to continue explaining, so he quickly changed his words. All right, I'll listen to you, my lord. Let's get back to the topic. I've only completed less than 300 sets of the elemental furnace. Would my lord like to inspect them? Of course, it would be best if I could, Brando nodded. He wanted to see how the elemental furnace was progressing, but not here. Is there a secret room in this workshop? Of course, Bosley glared at him. Why are you being so sneaky? You're up to no good. Brando shook his head with a smile. If the old man is as honest as he claims, then why would he have a secret room in the workshop? He did not remember making any special arrangements for the elemental furnace, but he did not dare to say it out loud. Bosley might really throw the three of them out in a fit of rage, and that would be a huge loss. Bosley led the three of them through the busy workshop and opened a door in the south to enter the secret room. But Brando soon realized that he had misunderstood the old man. The so-called secret room was more like a temporary storeroom or resting room. The storeroom was not big, only about a few dozen square meters. There were many boxes and barrels placed around it. Bosley opened one of the boxes with a shovel and took out a set of strange armor. It was indeed a peculiar set of armor. At least in the eyes of most normal people, that thing really couldn't be considered a set of armor. Or rather, it was better to say that it was more like a set of failed apprentices. Because when you saw it for the first time, you would wonder if anyone could wear it. It did not have a helmet, nor did it have a collar. The chest and back plates were tightly fitted together, and the position of the hands and feet were different from a normal person's. More importantly, the set of armor was extremely heavy. Bosley had to use all his strength to take it out of the box. The old man could even bet that even if it was given to the knights to wear, most of them would not be able to wear it even if it was not for its strange shape. It was simply too heavy. In the end, Bosley threw the armor onto the table while panting heavily. Look, this is completely designed according to your blueprint. I can guarantee that there are no changes, and I can also guarantee that no normal person would be able to wear it. Bosley's eyes widened as he glared at Brendel. Look, this is completely designed according to your blueprint. I can guarantee that there are no changes, and I can also guarantee that no normal person would be able to wear it. He shook his head. I don't know what you're trying to do with this set of armor. Oh no, it's not just one set, it's 200 sets. Brando smiled as he listened to Bosley's complaints. He was very satisfied with the set of armor. He had to admit that Bosley's craftsmanship was worthy of being called the best in Erewhon. He was known as the only divine blacksmith in Erewhon before the Second War of the Black Roses. At the very least, the set of armor required a level 60 master blacksmith to make. Before the Second War of the Black Roses, master blacksmiths were a title that did not exist even among crafting players. Even after 20 years, master blacksmiths were still considered treasures in China. It was no wonder that Brando looked at Bosley with a smile as if he was looking at a treasure. Are you even listening to what I'm saying, you little rascal? The old man looked at Brendel, who was smiling without saying a word, and suddenly became angry. Of course, Brando nodded. I'm very happy with it. I know you're happy with it, but you haven't answered my question. What is it? Bosley suddenly felt a little discouraged. He felt that talking to this young man was an arduous task because he could never catch up with his thoughts. You'll understand soon enough, Grandmaster Bosley. Then? Wait a moment, I don't think it's best if I don't tell you. Then what do you mean? Bosley was surprised. At this moment, someone knocked on the door. Bosley was startled. It was rare for someone to disturb him when he was resting. He raised his eyebrows and shouted, Who is it? It's me, Grandmaster Bosley. The voice outside shrank back. How would I know who you are, you bastard? Bosley saw the smile on the young man's face and couldn't help but get angry. He couldn't help but roar, Speak, what is it? You better find a reason to convince me, otherwise I'll kick you out of here. It's like this. They're here to see the Lord. The old man paused and looked at Brendel in confusion. Brando nodded. Let them in. Bosley replied. The door was pushed open, and the one standing outside was the young man named Mordenkainen. Of course, his duck familiar had been put away, and this time, there was another strange guy behind him. It was a short man whose entire body was covered by a long cloak. A dwarf. Bosley was surprised. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 352. No, you're wrong, Grandmaster Bosley. Brando shook his head. The young man closed the door. The mysterious guest took off his cloak, revealing a hunched body and a feathered robe that covered his wrinkled skin. Tajiv bowed deeply to Brando. Subterrane dwellers? Bosley asked in surprise. Wait, my lord, you mean? The blacksmith reacted quickly. The equipment he designed according to the blueprint was not usable by humans, but it was tailor-made for these creatures. My lord, when did you come into contact with the subterrane dwellers? Didn't we fight with them? But, then what's going on? The old man was puzzled. During the battle with Lord Maxon, Brando purposely sealed the news. Most of the captives were locked up in the dungeon, and no one was allowed to come in contact with them. Thus, the news of the subterrane dwellers participating in the battle was not leaked. Furthermore, Bosley didn't care about Brando's military affairs. He was focused on his smithing workshop, so he didn't know that Brando's subordinates had merged with a large number of subterrane dwellers. My lord, you're amazing. Tajiv maintained a respectful posture, but it faced the master craftsman and replied with a sentence in Kurlutz that it was not familiar with. So you've subdued them? Bosley turned to Brendel and asked. Brando nodded. Martha Buff. The old man shouted, How many have you subdued? Bosley immediately shut his mouth as he thought of a possibility. The old man stared at Brando with wide eyes and raised his trembling hand. 500? 500. That was the number Brando wanted for the armor. The young man smiled and shook his head. Bosley was oversimplifying things. It was just like humans. No matter how strong the subterrane dwellers were, it was impossible for them to be the strongest. He glanced at Tajiv.
Even though the subterranean dweller was respectful to him, he wouldn't leave the fate of his tribe in his hands. 3,000, he said. Bosley choked a little and quickly held onto the corner of the table. I understand now. It seems like my old bones can't keep up with you youngsters. He shook his head. 3,000 subterranean dwellers? Then how did the young man win? Not to mention subduing them. It was no wonder that the mercenaries, especially the younger generation of mercenaries, worshipped this lord so much. Originally he was somewhat dismissive, but now it seemed that it was not just blind worship. All right, Bosley replied, I understand. Lord Paulus is in big trouble now. It's not that simple. Count Randner won't be so rash as to charge headlong into the matter. He's an old fox. Brendel shook his head. Sir Maxon's lesson should be enough to make him more cautious. Are you saying that Lord Paulus will have reinforcements? Isn't that inevitable? Brando replied. The old man stroked his chin. Is that why you want to arm these cavemen? That's right. Brando patted the armor and said to Tajiv, Tajiv, give it a try. My lord, what is this? Tajiv could not see clearly, but it could hear that the armor was made of metal. You'll know once you put it on. Witch doctor. Tajiv finally understood that it was a set of armor and hurriedly waved its hands. My lord. It's fine, I'm just giving it a try. Brando smiled. This is a gift from me. You won't reject it, right? Gift. The subterranean dweller was taken aback. Your tribe isn't one of the strongest in the underworld, right? Brando asked. Tajiv fell silent. It nodded. If it was a strong tribe, they would not have been forced to the surface. Compared to living on the surface, they were more willing to return to the underworld. However, its tribe was not considered small. It was just that it did not have a strong underworld lord to back it up. Tajiv knew that it had a hidden problem. In the tribe that its ancestors left behind for it, there were many old and weak people. There were very few people who were qualified to fight in the underworld. It's fine, Brando did not mind. I've said it before. If we can't improve our strength and skills, then we can focus on improving our equipment. Equipment? Improve? Tajiv repeated doubtfully. I plan to give your tribe 500 sets of heavy armor, Brando replied. Heavy armor, specifically for the subterranean dwellers. The subterranean dweller was shocked by this number. 500 sets of heavy armor was a huge fortune even in the underworld. The underworld lords would definitely not use these things to arm a group of subterranean dwellers. In other words, they were a group of cannon fodder. It raised its head and stuttered, Subterranean dwellers, don't wear armor, my lord. Subterranean dwellers don't wear armor? Brendel could not help but curse in his mind. The subterranean dweller lord, Master Siege Master Alach's assault squad, and their performance in the Third War was still fresh in his mind. The set of armor in his hands was actually the original design of the rhinoceros armor designed by Alach. Of course, he hadn't gotten his hands on the later versions, but this set of armor was ahead of its time in the year of summer and summer leaves. Brando remembered clearly that the first set of rhino armor was created about 5 years later. Are you willing to be cannon fodder? This will become history, Tajiv. The young man shook his head. I've said before, this set of armor is specially designed for you. Wait. Bosley stopped the two of them. My lord, are you saying that this set of armor has never existed before? Of course. The old man looked at the young man and was a little angry. You didn't even let these fellows try on a set of newly designed armor, and you made me make 200 sets. Bosley was almost shouting at the end of his sentence. He felt that Brando was making a joke out of him. There had never been such a thing in history. A set of newly designed armor was mass-produced without even testing it. Did this guy think it was a toy? Bosley could understand if Brando was rich enough to rival a kingdom, but he was clearly in the early stages of his territory, and it was difficult to even maintain it. The amount of iron ores used to make 200 sets of armor was almost all of the AB's reserves. It even delayed the construction of the city walls because of this. Amandina had complained to him more than once about this matter. The more Bosley spoke, the angrier he became, especially when he thought about how Brando kept saying that he was on the princess side. If everyone by the princess side was like this young man, then this damned kingdom might not even have a future. He felt that he, the chief craftsman of the kingdom, was being played by this young man. Bosley glared at Brando. If this young lord did not give him an explanation, then he would let him know that even a master craftsman like him had his own temper. And it was a very bad temper. But Brando's expression did not change at all. He was only a little surprised when Bosley lost his temper. He did not expect the old man to be so angry,
but he laughed when he heard Bosley's words. Is there a need to be so angry, Grandmaster Bosley? He shook his head. How can you still laugh? You better give me an explanation, damn it. Bosley said indignantly, otherwise I'll give you an explanation today. How do you intend to give me an explanation? Brando crossed his arms and asked calmly. When the two of them started arguing, they seemed to have forgotten about Tadgev. Of course, Mr. Mordenkainen had been forgotten from the start. I'll go on strike. Bosley stomped his feet. All right, calm down. Brando shook his head. Grandmaster Bosley, you're the chief craftsman of the kingdom. Can't you tell if this armor will work or not? It's because I'm the chief craftsman of the kingdom that I have to stop your irresponsible behavior. Bosley said angrily, but he still glanced at the subterrane dweller chieftain. He was familiar with the armor he made himself. He only needed to look at the subterrane dweller chieftain to know that there was nothing wrong with Brando's design. The subterrane dweller chieftain looked a little bigger. But since Tadgev claimed to be a witch doctor, the subterrane dweller chieftain must have a stronger physique, and the armor would fit him well. As for the subterrane dwellers with a different physique, he would only need to make some slight modifications. Bosley's anger subsided a little when he saw this, and he was surprised. Drawing a blueprint and completing a finished product with just experience alone would require at least a few decades of forging experience. Even he himself might not be able to do it. The old man glanced at Brendel and thought to himself, is this young man a hidden master? But he did not believe it and asked with some anger, you didn't make this armor, did you? Brendel nodded. He did not want to steal someone else's work. This is the design of a friend of mine, and he has done a lot of research on the subterrane dwellers. Of course, the moment he opened his mouth, the subterrane dweller became his friend. At this moment, a certain someone in the Georgindy Ridge couldn't help but sneeze. That's more like it. Brendel satisfied the old man's conjecture, and the old man did not pursue the matter any further. It's best if you don't play this trick on me in the future. Leave this kind of surprise to the youngsters. My old bones can't take it anymore. You're exaggerating, Brando replied with a smile. Of course not. I didn't do it on purpose. Grandmaster Bosley, you are now the most valuable asset in my territory. This is only a temporary job. Bosley mumbled, but he did not forget to remind Brando of this fact. But the young man's compliment still made him feel good. Brando shook his head and turned to the subterrane dweller chieftain. How about it, Tadgev? Are you willing to accept this gift? Tadgev hesitated for a moment. When Brando and Bosley were talking, it had already touched the armor. Due to the lack of vision, the subterrane dwellers were more sensitive to touch and hearing than normal humans. Even though it only touched the armor roughly, it was certain that it was made for one of its kind. It was tempted, but it knew that there was no such thing as a free lunch. The subterrane dweller hesitated for a moment and asked, My lord, conditions? Brando nodded. He was satisfied with Tadgev's reaction. Of course, he would not give the subterrane dwellers 500 sets of armor for free. Even though the subterrane dwellers and the ABs were allies, this was not enough. The conditions are simple. Brando replied. Then he lowered his voice and whispered something into the subterrane dweller chieftain's ear. Tadgev was stunned for a moment. It hesitated for a moment, but it still nodded in the end. A deal. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.gdn.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 353. The 7th day of the month of slumber. After the first snowfall. The harsh winter had sealed off all the roads from the mountains of Erek to the countryside of Ampere Seal. The lobbyists of the various forces in the free port had wasted 2 months of time in vain. In the end, their efforts were in vain. The cold season finally froze the unstable situation in the north, and the ferocious rumors about the war in the north from 2 months ago had finally disappeared like a rumor without any proof. But only those who could see through all of this understood that there was a deeper layer of danger hidden under this false calm. Beneath the surface of the world that was wrapped in silver and everything was frozen was not silence. Instead, it was an outburst of patience. Swords and blades were screaming, thirsting for blood. It was as if winter had passed and spring had arrived. After the snowflakes had bloomed, what seeped into the ground was not snow, but blood. Brando knew this very well. It was just like how he knew the history books in black and white. However, when the earth went into hibernation, there was a hidden power that was ready to move under the snow. When the old knight Lord Paulus led his subordinates to this small hill in Tanagel's territory for the first time,
He did not know that the news of the war in Tanajil had already spread to the desks of the dukes and lords. During this sensitive period, a single spark could ignite the situation. Everyone thought that Princess Griffin was taking the risk, but no one thought that the silver-haired girl could only accept Brando's good intentions with a bitter smile. So where would Count Randner go from here? This was a question that could only be answered with deep meaning. But no one would care about the fate of a chess piece. When Princess Griffin received the news that Lord Paulus had begun to march towards Abes, she could not help but shake the parchment with two of her fingers. She smiled and said to Oberway, who was beside her, "Oberway, who do you think will win?" Oberway bowed slightly. "Reason tells me that Count Randner will definitely win, but my intuition tells me otherwise." "What if he wins?" "Then Count Randner will not dare to act rashly." "What if you lose?" Arek is also inclined to let Count Randner remain neutral, which is exactly what that old bastard wants. In other words, it's beneficial to us and not harmful at all? If only your highness could realize that Count Randner is not on the same side as us. It's a pity that Makarov and Grandmaster Fleetwood can't see that. The silver-haired girl sighed as she rested her chin on her hand. Oberway did not answer immediately. In his opinion, Grandmaster Fleetwood and Count Randner were able to see this point, but it was due to their own considerations. Perhaps Count Randner was more reliable than an unknown youth. Makarov did not wish for the princess to interact too much with the youth, and Oberway was keenly aware of this. He couldn't say these words out loud, otherwise, it would cause suspicion within the royal faction. However, he believed that this intelligent princess would be able to see through it. "Tell me," Princess Griffin raised her slender eyelashes slightly as she stared at the vassal, "why did he do this? Is it because of his so-called goodwill towards the royal family?" The princess shook her head again. Her background made her naturally distrustful of such goodwill that was not related to benefits. "I'm afraid not. In my opinion, it's because of the ambition of an adventurer." "Ambition?" Princess Griffin blinked her eyes. But at this very moment, the old knight Lord Paulus, who was standing in the cold wind, clearly didn't know that there was a beautiful princess who was evaluating the fates of both sides. The old knight lifted his mask with his wrinkled and calloused hands and exhaled a white breath in the cold air. He looked at the distant mountains covered in white mist. At the foot of the mountain was the camp that was attacked. This was the 6th time this week that the camp was attacked. The attackers were subterranean dwellers, and they were still subterranean dwellers. The wrinkles on the old man's forehead were almost squeezed together, and his aged face was like a piece of tree bark. Behind him, the figures of the other knights came out from the forest one after another. Most of them had solemn expressions. They originally thought that the undulating hills of the Maxon region were not as dangerous as Mount Greyhar, and that the enemy, the rioters, were not as elusive as the Highlanders. They thought that they could breathe a sigh of relief, but most of them saw the upcoming war as an opportunity to relax. However, they did not expect to meet an even more troublesome enemy before they even met the refugees. "Are these damned subterranean dwellers rioting?" Someone cursed angrily. The subterranean dwellers attacked all kinds of targets, and were not limited to military targets. Sometimes even granaries and manors were within their hunting range. Even though Count Randner's army had yet to gather, these elusive attacks had already caused the people in the territory to panic. The losses caused by the attacks were not great, but Lord Paulus was worried that it would delay the gathering of the army. Especially recently, it had developed to the campsite where the Aboriginals gathered. This was the second campsite to be attacked. The subterranean dwellers were extremely fast in the forest, and when they attacked, the Highlanders were not ready to defend themselves. As a result, the monsters broke in from the north and quickly retreated after killing many people. The terrain in the forest was complicated, and the cavalry could not spread out to chase after the subterranean dwellers. "How many people did we lose?" "Not many. A dozen or so died, but many were injured." "How many did we lose in the past week?" "Nearly 100, the knight replied, "and this does not include the losses in battle." "Why are there losses in battle?" Lord Paulus turned around and asked. It was still too early for the war to begin, and the mobilization of provisions and other resources was far slower than expected. The Highlanders' gathering speed was also not fast enough. Less than 20% of them had arrived. However, what made him curious was that he did not give any orders, so why were there losses in battle? "It's because a group of Highlanders gathered in secret to retaliate, but they were ambushed when they entered Maxon. Only 1 or 2 of them returned," the knight replied. "These fools," the old knight cursed. "Then how many people did we lose from the first attack until now?" The knight looked at each other before one of them answered. More than 300. But 2 weeks, Lord Paulus shook his head. He could accept this loss. If he did not take the initiative to attack, he would not be able to do anything about it. But in his opinion, this was the last struggle of the Highlanders. In the past 2 months, Lord Paulus had gathered enough information. The noble's private soldiers who had escaped from Abes had given him a lot of useful information. For example, he knew that Brando had hundreds or even thousands of subterranean dwellers under his command. With hundreds of subterranean dwellers and thousands of mercenaries, Lord Paulus felt that if he fought steadily, he would have a good chance of winning. He would not make the same mistake that Lord Maxon made a second time. In fact, the old knight knew that based on his personality he would not even make the same mistake the first time. He caressed the hilt of his sword. He had heard that Carglaise was also captured by the Highlanders, and he had been worried about his student for a long time. Lord Paulus's original plan would take about a month and a half, and he did not care even if the Highlanders lost another 1,000 lives or a third of them were forced to withdraw from the battle. But the old knight knew that numbers did not work that way on the battlefield. If what he predicted happened, it would be a fatal blow to the morale of the Highlanders. The Highlanders might even fall into chaos. He could see that the Highlanders were pressuring him, trying to force him into a decisive battle. But things were not that simple. The Highlanders who were ambushed were the best proof of this. Lord Paulus knew that he could not act rashly, but on the other hand, the incessant chattering of the Highlanders gave him a headache. Their words were not without reason. The subterranean dwellers had gone deep into the forest and burned down one of Lord Paulus's granaries. This made Lord Paulus suspect that there was a loophole in Schaffel's plan. The subterranean dwellers could only enter Lord Paulus's territory through that direction. But Schaffel's spies reported that everything was normal. Lord Paulus even sent out a second batch of spies, but they did not find anything out of the ordinary. This made the old knight curse Perkins for being in charge of Schaffland. It was a sieve that anyone could infiltrate. But he did not think that if it were not for this sieve, his men would not have been able to infiltrate. Lord Paulus touched his sword and suppressed the impulse in his heart. He shook his head and said, "Let's go back." "My lord," the knight was puzzled, "what about the subterranean dwellers? Have the Highlanders withdraw their defenses and change the route of their supplies? We also need to relocate the granaries. The enemy is in the dark while we are out in the open. We need to be more vigilant, but this will waste too much time. Why don't we just attack them directly?" "If you think that way, then your enemy will be happy," Lord Paulus replied coldly. "The undead of Madara, the Highlanders, and even the food and other supplies are not in place yet. If you lose Lord Paulus as well, then where will Count Randner put his face? We have a few thousand men in our hands and the Highlanders' army is nearing 2,000, the knight said. "Even if they add in the subterranean dwellers, they still won't be a match for us, right? That old fool Lord Maxon also thinks the same way. Did you see what happened to him? But if we do this, it will affect the time we have to gather, my lord." "That's fine too. It's best if we delay until the month of spring. It's not a good sign to send out troops in the winter." The knight shook his head. Even though this kind of harassment was harmless, it was no different from a slap to his face, and he had no way to retaliate. He was a cautious person and the enemy seemed to have seen through this point. However, the only thing he was confident about was that he would not make the decision to send out his troops early because of his anger. The old knight believed that he had seen through the enemy's desperate struggle, and he had to fight steadily and steadily. He had to trap the enemy bit by bit and not give them any chance to break out of this situation. He would slowly get back at them for the humiliation he suffered now. Delay until the month of spring? Won't Count Randner blame us for that? 3 months with Martha above, how much food do we need? My lord, if you do this, Count Randner will kill us. On the contrary, Lord Paulus looked at his old subordinates. The longer we delay, the better. You have to look further ahead. The battlefield is not limited to Tanajil. Before this war ends, Lord Randner will not cause trouble for you. There are some things that cannot be measured by money. Even though the old knight was a pure soldier, his experience allowed him to see through the waves behind this seemingly calm situation. Of course, if we can do it well, Count Randner will be able to rest easy, that's for sure. The knights echoed. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 354. Lord Paulus thought that he had seen through Brando's intentions. But the old knight would never understand what kind of existence was fighting against him on the other side of the forest.
Just like how Brando was familiar with every lord of Erewhon, whether they were in the past, present, or future, whether they were powerful or poor. He was familiar with them like he was familiar with his own fingerprints. From the year of summer leaves to the beginning of the Second Era, he had interacted with every lord of Erewhon, big or small. If Lord Paulus knew that Brando was able to call out his nickname from decades ago, he might have reconsidered his choice. But there was no if in history. When Brando received the news that the old knight had retreated from his study in Abies, he couldn't help but smile. He threw the report from Raven back onto the table. Raven was the name he gave to the first-line Magi scouts. Because they often used ravens to transmit information, the nickname spread like wildfire in the army. What a pity. Rabin also read the report. The former captain shook his head in disappointment. That old man is really cautious. If he didn't act rashly, we would have won half of this war. It's not a good habit to place your hopes on the enemy, Captain Rabin. Amandina stood beside Brando and looked at him coldly. As time went by, her prestige in the group increased day by day. Even though she was reprimanding him, it did not make Rabin feel that there was anything wrong with it. It was as if it was a matter of course and it was the way it should be. Rabin smiled. I just feel that it's a pity. Now that he has retreated, we will have to face a tough battle. That's not necessarily true. Brando replied softly. He knew that the old knight was cautious, but he had an unyielding character in his blood. Just like how he understood the old knight's preferred style of fighting and what kind of choices he would make. This so-called report was just a small trap he had arranged. No matter what choice he made, it would not be out of his expectations. Amandina glanced at him from behind. She had known about this plan since the day Tajiv left the city, and his arrangements had left her in disbelief. It did not seem like a strategy but more like a prediction. But now this prediction had come true. Amandina was also a little dumbfounded. She looked at Brando's back in a daze. Not necessarily? Rabin did not understand. Lord Paulus graduated from the Royal Academy when he was young and participated in the November War. He is the most serious of the Academy's officers. Brando replied, Did you know that on the wall of the Royal Academy, there is a sentence written in Crew's language? To the knight's goal is to prevent the other party's goal. This sentence is the core of Erewhon's military philosophy, and it is regarded as a classic by all the officers who graduated from the Academy. Rabin nodded. Even Cornelius and Medisha nodded in agreement. Rabin was born in the army, so he was not unfamiliar with this saying. However, Cornelius had decades of experience in the field, so he could understand the truth behind this saying. Cornelius had the same experience as Cornelius, and he could see the truth behind this saying. As for Medisha, the princess' understanding of war did not need to be explained. So it's the same for Lord Paulus? Amandina snapped out of her daze and whispered, Is that right, my lord? Yes, my lord. Brando continued, That's why I sent the subterranean dwellers to harass, plunder and invade Paulus's territory. We are like cornered beasts, and we need to find an opportunity to break the stalemate before Count Randner's army gathers. Isn't that our situation? Rabin asked. Yes, Brando nodded, but is there really such a foolish enemy? Would he tell you the truth so that you can complete a critical strike? Brando leaned back in his chair, not looking like a lord at all. Amandina's brows were furrowed, and Falern's expression was not any better. However, the young man seemed to be in a good mood and he blurted out a game term. Critical strike. It's an ancient language, Brando lied without batting an eyelid. It's called critical strike. Rabin nodded in agreement. That's why this is the reverse way of thinking, Medisha whispered. If we ask for a battle, he will not let us do as we wish. But on the other hand, according to the strict way of thinking, the enemy will not expose his weakness to us so directly. He will definitely find a way to hide his goal. Unless this is a trap. Rabin continued. What kind of message is this trap trying to convey? Cornelius asked. The enemy wants to stall for time. Rabin replied. He had obviously put himself in Lord Paulus's shoes. Then the way to destroy this goal is to send out troops as soon as possible. But what if this is a double trap? The discussion quickly became heated. So no matter what, there are only two choices left. Amandina pulled herself out of this train of thought and calmly answered, Either we wait for the army to gather, or we immediately send out troops and cut the Gordian knot. But Medisha shook her head. Military calculations aren't that simple. After all, this isn't a rock-paper-scissors game that relies solely on analyzing the enemy's mentality. The Silver Elf Princess replied, Some things can't be hidden, such as military strength, resources, morale, weather, geography, and possible reinforcements. These two choices and this information are enough for Lord Paulus to make a choice. Also, there is the factor of personality, Brando added. After Medicia's reminder, Rabin regained his senses and looked at Brando in confusion. Then my lord, where is the trap? According to the Silver Fairy Princess, Lord Paulus should be able to make the correct decision easily. And it seems that the old knight did indeed make the correct decision. Just like what the young lord said, they were like cornered beasts fighting for a chance to break the stalemate before Count Randner's army gathered. But now that Lord Paulus chose to wait for the army to gather, they had lost this precious opportunity. Isn't that right? Rabin saw Brando shaking his head and smiled. Didn't I already set up the trap? All of you are in it and you won't be able to detect it. What? Everyone was shocked. The young lord smiled and tapped his forehead. The so-called limitation of thinking is that I asked you a question that is neither yes nor no, and you fell into a whirlpool of choices because of this question. But have you ever thought that this is a real war? There are thousands of possibilities in a war, and there are not only two choices. If you can't jump out of this maze of thinking, then you won't be able to see the third choice. Everyone present was stunned. The third choice? Rabin asked with a frown. If Lord Paulus chooses to attack, then he will be attacked head-on, and we will break the stalemate. Brando replied, but of course he won't be so stupid. I don't think even Grodin will make such a low-level mistake. But if he chooses to retreat and give me 2 or 3 months to delay the war until after the month of spring's dawn, then I will still welcome him. Brando shrugged. What do we lack? Time. But time is not necessarily in our favor, my lord. Amandina's brows were furrowed as usual, as if her brows had not relaxed for the past month. Rabin looked at her and reminded her seriously, frowning too much will cause wrinkles, Miss Amandina. The noble lady rolled her eyes at him. Anyway, I'll let you take responsibility for it, she shuddered slightly. Brendel smiled faintly, as if it was something that gave him a sense of accomplishment to be able to make his assistant relax. He smiled and explained, don't worry, time will be on our side in the end. He was not speaking carelessly. Ever since the Druids returned to his territory, he knew that they would have news about Valhalla. This was no different from history, and he made a series of arrangements for it. He ordered Tajiv to harass Lord Paulus and delay the old knight's attack. All of it was to achieve this goal. Only Brando knew what Valhalla meant, so he had to delay the war as much as possible until the legendary territory was under his control. After that, everything would be fine. Knowing this in his heart, he looked at the others. They looked at him suspiciously, but at least they knew that this young lord never lied. But won't that old bastard notice that something is wrong? Rabin still felt that it was a little strange. Did you notice it? Brando asked. But that's only for a moment. A moment decides everything, and the final outcome of a war can be changed by 1 or 2 small details. Brando shook his head. The biggest taboo for a commander is to be indecisive, and changing a decision repeatedly is a taboo. Moreover, if he decides to retreat today, he will have to deal with Tajiv's harassment from now on. Even if he realizes it, he will have slowed down the pace of gathering his troops, and it will be too late for regrets. Then doesn't that mean he will lose no matter what? Rabin asked. I gave him a test paper and the 2 choices were arranged by me. Why won't he lose? Brando replied, sometimes you need to change your roles, but following your opponent's rhythm is not a good thing. Brando suddenly stopped talking because he felt the surroundings become quiet. All of his subordinates were looking at him strangely as if they were looking at a monster. The young man felt awkward. It was not a profound method but something that Incersta had played around with. During the Second War of the Black Roses, Sir Black had humiliated the old man like this, and Brando was only using it as a reference. So what should we do? Rabin asked. What should we do? Do your job well, Brendel replied. This is the second thing I'm going to tell you today. I'm going to leave the territory for a trip that will take a month or more. He clasped his hands together and interlaced his fingers. I don't want the territory to be in a mess when I return. My lord, you are leaving again? Amandina frowned. Schaflund? It's a secret. The young man put his finger to his lips. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 355. After deciding on the itinerary, Brando began to prepare for his trip to the Black Forest. However, he did not leave immediately. Instead, he waited for a few more days. After confirming that Lord Paulus had retracted his defenses, Brando was able to carry out his plan with ease. On the day of his departure, he arrived at a courtyard in his castle. "Your swordsmanship has improved again." Coden bent down to pick up the sword and put it back on the weapon rack. The old swordsman looked at Brando with envy and helplessness, but he was also looking forward to it. "I'm old now. I'm no longer your opponent." Brendel did not try to be humble, but he smiled shyly like a young man. Ever since the discussion, Brando's schedule had been increasing day by day. Everyone was preparing for the trip, but he seemed to be a little relaxed. The battle took 10 minutes and he won in the end. The young man was not too surprised. After the battle in the underground, and with the guidance of the female knight Orthless, his swordsmanship had improved by leaps and bounds. He could not be compared to the first time he fought with Coden. His military swordsmanship was stuck at level 16+2, and there was no further progress. The channel for him to invest in his skills was also grayed out. Brando knew that his swordsmanship was nearing its limit. After reaching the peak of the master level, he would have to rely on repeated practice or an epiphany one day to invest in his swordsmanship. Today, Brando was wearing a black cruise traveler's uniform, which was developed from the warrior culture of the Tower people. It was usually made of some kind of woolen material. The top was like a shirt, but the sleeves and trousers were unusually loose. He put on a pair of gauntlets and riding boots. Adventurers and nobles usually wore a double-layered belt to hang their swords. However, Brando had specially made Haurangaya's scabbard for a broadsword. He sheathed the sword and replied, "Times have changed, Mr. Coden." Coden looked up at him but did not say anything. Coden didn't say anything, but Brando didn't press him either. He took out a piece of cloth and gently wiped his sword as he thought about what had happened a few days ago. The meeting with the Druids was rather harmonious. Andrew had yet to return from the loop of trade winds, so an elder named Grey Raven came instead. Grey Raven symbolized the elves of the storm. To be able to use this title as a code name, it meant that this elder was proficient in druid spells within the wind domain. The wind domain represented the sky, and the druids of the sky domain often enjoyed a high status within the druid organization. Therefore, Brando guessed that this person might not be an ordinary outer circle elder like Andrew, but an inner circle big druid. Druids were connected to each other by a secret organization, known as the Druid Assembly. The structure of this organization was circular, and the inner circle was called the Trade Wind Council. Every member was an archdruid, and they communicated with each other through the winds of summer, autumn and winter thousands of miles away. Only spring was the season of Naya. The druids had to give way to the wind so that they could not disturb the goddess Rise. As expected, the druids brought him a piece of news that he had not expected. Grey Raven told him that they might have found Valhalla, but in fact they had encountered a little trouble. The loop of trade winds seemed to be undergoing some unusual changes. The laws of the Black Forest were once again rearranged. The druids encountered fog and strong winds, and their sense of direction in the forest, which they were so proud of, was no longer effective. The archdruid said that the trees there seemed to be repelling them. If not for the fact that they were not hostile, it would have been difficult for them to even walk out of the forest. Brando pondered for a moment and guessed what they might have encountered. The power of the moon of magic was growing stronger with each passing day, and the chaos in the darkness was becoming restless. Even the forest was affected and began to show signs of change. This was a difficult problem and there was almost no way to solve it. The only way to solve it was to force their way in. But this required strength and the druids couldn't do it. Although the archdruid seemed to have the strength of a gold-tier warrior, they knew too little about Valhalla. It seemed that he had to go there himself. But that was fine as well. It was exactly what he wanted. He set aside a month and a half, and thought that it would be more than enough for him to arrange this trip. But just as he was thinking of this, a sudden argument interrupted his thoughts. "Stop. I want to see your commander. I know he's already back. Stop talking nonsense. A captive should have the self-awareness of a captive. Why do you have so many demands?" This was the voice of a soldier. Brando raised his head and looked in the direction of the voice. It was the dungeon, and a funny expression appeared on his face. This was not the first time he had heard of such a dispute. "You untrustworthy bastards. The last time I defeated that bastard, he promised to let me see your commander. If you have the guts, make him come again. I guarantee that I'll beat him until he pisses his pants." "Shut up." The soldier scolded. "Captain Cornelius went easy on you. Didn't you see that his sword was broken in the fight? Then why don't you make him change to a better sword and fight me?" The voice did not hide the sarcasm. "Brat, do you want to be taught a lesson again?" The soldier was clearly impatient. Then there were a few cries of pain. Brando quickly saw a young man wearing a white shirt running out from behind the bushes. The young man's light blonde hair was slightly messy, and he seemed to be in a sorry state. However, he held a sword in his hand. Brando noticed that the sword was not stained with blood. When the young man ran out from behind the bushes, he was surprised to see someone outside. When he saw that Brando was holding a sword, he subconsciously thought that he was one of the guards and immediately went forward to greet him. Brando was slightly surprised. He wondered why he let someone run out, but before he could finish his thoughts, he saw the young man lunge towards him with a sword in his hand. The young man's sword was pointed at Brando's right arm. It was obvious that he did not want to kill him, but the speed of his sword was extremely fast and his hand was steady. This showed that he had a good foundation in swordsmanship. This surprised Brando as he knew that his 4 captains, Yuta, Cornelius, Rabin and Cornelius, were not a match for this young man. Damn, military swordsmanship at least level 8. Brando thought to himself. No wonder the Nightsong Tiger, Rabin and Cornelius were almost unable to kill this young man. He was indeed a talent. His first thought was to knock the young man's sword away, but he changed his mind. He wanted to test the young man's strength. Brando changed his stance twice in an instant. He flicked his sword upwards and blocked the young man's sword, then pushed it outwards, causing the young man's center of gravity to tilt. Even though Karglai's attack was neutralized, Brando was merciful and did not knock his sword away. He almost thought that his eyes were playing tricks on him. That ordinary-looking guard seemed to be a master swordsman? But that was impossible. The young man gritted his teeth and attacked again. However, Brando's Haurangaya softened and slapped the young man's left and right arms. He did not use his full strength, nor did he use Earthquake. Instead, he used his immense strength to push the young man back. In the end, the young man fell to the ground on his butt. Full of flaws but commendable, Brando thought to himself. He saw the young man stand up again and subconsciously raised his sword. He wanted to see if the young man knew any other swordsmanship. But at that moment he saw Karglais throw his sword away and raise his hand. I surrender. Karglais stared at Brando with his light gray eyes. He knew that the young man was a master swordsman. He did not stand a chance. But he only felt annoyed. If he knew this would happen, he would not have run in this direction. Now that he thought about it, he found it laughable that he took the initiative to attack the young man. He looked at the old man and thought that he should have run away from here. But when he saw Koden looking at him with a smile and the old swordsman's slender fingers and countless calluses, he realized that his defeat was inevitable. Who are you? Karglais asked curiously. He allowed the soldiers who caught up to him to tie his hands behind his back. The soldiers were angry at him for injuring others, so they did not hold back, causing him to grit his teeth in pain. Fortunately, the young man did not kill anyone. Otherwise, the soldiers would have beaten him up in front of their lord. Brando did not answer but looked at the young man with interest. He looked at the young man and suddenly had a new idea. Aren't you afraid that I'll kill you? Why would you kill me? Karglais was not afraid. There's nothing to gain from it. Kill the chicken to warn the monkey. Brando replied. Then you can do it. The young man puffed out his chest. If I blink, I will no longer be a man of the Huberto family. So a man only cares about himself and not your father? Brando asked. What does being a man have to do with my father? Karglais was puzzled. Brando was surprised. After all, the culture of this world was different from his original world. He looked at the soldiers again. Why didn't you kill them? The young man shook his head. Why do you always talk about killing? I'm much stronger than them. I don't need to kill them to escape. But if both sides have the same strength, then I can only fight with my life. He answered honestly. But he's your enemy. I can't kill all of them. Karglais raised his eyebrows and shrugged. What's more, if I'm caught, I'll be the one in trouble. Just like now. You thought it through. Brando suddenly found the young man interesting. Well, do you still want to know who I am? Didn't I just ask? Then what should you call me? Brando looked back at the soldiers. The soldiers quickly took a step back and lowered their heads. They placed one hand on their chest and saluted, My lord. My lord. Brendel turned around and saw the young man staring at him with his mouth agape. His mouth was wide enough to swallow an egg. He could not believe his eyes. You are? Brendel nodded and laughed in his heart, but his face did not show it. Yes, I'm the one you want to see. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.